and Mwanajamii, it comes with a lot of responsibilities, right? So I had some things that I needed to attend to this morning. That's why I slightly delayed, but apologies for that. I hope those who are online were not completely bored, but we are here. And my intention today is to finish the lectures as much as possible, preferably by 1, because I have an engagement after that. Whatever remains, we'll finish tomorrow, and then we will do the discussions, sort of questions, to discuss cases, get some insights. Those who would wish to engage further, Friday will be an ideal day for that. Yesterday, we talked a lot of practical issues with respect to design issues, right? And I hope you got something out of that conversation. We talked about operational issues. We talked about qualitative evaluation approaches, how they are applied. Today, we are talking of a very fundamental aspect of this training, which applies across the board. It doesn't have to be an economist. It can apply in any field, because in all these fields that we have, we do sampling, right? And I've been talking about sampling. So what we're going to learn is what we call sampling, what it is. We will learn power analysis. How do we do power analysis? Meaning, how do we decide how big the sample should be? In your study, you are designing, you want to collect sample, and you are wondering how big my sample should be for an evaluation. Are we together? And then we will go to answer, discuss a bit different sampling approaches. My intention is before lunch, we would also have a chance to discuss practical field issues when it comes to data collection. Okay? And I will use an example of a project I did in Kenya as a way of sort of taking you through how we did it and what are the ethical issues you need to consider. So basically today, in terms of coverage, we expect to do sampling. We'll talk about power analysis, sample size, and how large of an impact is expected. We'll talk about sampling strategies and what are the key questions we need to think through, especially with randomization. We'll talk about clustering. I talked about clustering. On the first day, I talked a concept called inter-cluster correlation. Today, I will clarify and you'll see how it relates. And how can we increase the statistical power? How do we increase the sample size so that we are able to detect the minimum effect of our intervention? Okay, how do we increase the statistical power? So there'll be a little bit of math, but again, I will try to make it as friendly as possible because there's no statistics without math. And then we will talk about different sampling approaches that you can think about when you're designing your study, and that will be very useful for you. All right, so let's start off with sampling. Why do we sample? I don't want to do recap today. We'll do recap tomorrow of everything. Why do we sample? Can someone tell me why do we sample? Online, why do we sample? Why do we sample? Yeah? Yes? Try? Want to try? Yes? Why do we sample?
I think the main reason is because it's sometimes it's expensive, to deal with the total population.
Yeah, it is expensive to collect information from the entire population. That's true. Anyone else? Why do we sample? Okay.
I think to have a targeted population so that we do something which is accurate.
To identify the targeted population. We sample because we want to identify targeted population. Okay, those are good answers. Now, let's get into it. So we sample, we usually cannot gather data from the entire target population. We have to, for the reasons she said, it can be costly. You don't have to start the entire Kenya to infer what is happening in Kenya. Are we together? You don't have to start the entire South Africa to infer what is happening in South Africa. Okay? You only have to draw a representative sample that characterizes the entire population for you to be able to make sense of what is happening in a particular community, in a particular targeted population. For example, when we were talking of randomization, we talked of random sampling from targeted population to evaluation sample, right? So what random sampling does, it allows you to infer characteristics of the target group from the smaller sample. So you have population, what we call population characteristics. You also have a smaller group drawn from the population, we call sample characteristics. Are we together? What we usually do in statistics is to try to make sense of characteristics of a small sample. How representative are they from the population statistics? Statistics. So if it's a mean, if an average of the sample, how much is it differing from the average of the population? If they're close to each other, you don't need the entire population to draw inferences, right? You need the sample. Are we together? Are we together? So a good example here for those who math allergic, this is the target group. Do you have to go and draw a sample for each and every one? The answer is no. What you can do, you can draw a random sample, and we saw how random sample, you can close your eyes and Anna, do, where, Kuja, well, that one is sampled, Anna, but I can also choose to make sure the hand is going that direction. Yeah? that introduces bias, right? But these days with computers, with dice and coin, you can do that. So here is the sample that was drawn from the target population, and the sample has the same average characteristics as the target group. What you need is the representation. And remember, we talked about external validity during randomization. What was the external validity for? You're drawing a sample that is representative of the entire population. Are we together? Okay. Now, are we clear? Are we clear? Good. So in terms of the evaluation, if we are thinking of the evaluation, we talked about this when we are doing the way we do random assignment, right? It's exactly the same. I'm drawing back your attention to it so that we can actually move fast. So here is the population, okay? You split the population into two groups by random lot. You know, you draw randomly. Those who are looking for work here, and others not looking for work for some reason. And then out of these, you draw another random sample. You get some here, you get some here. And these ones who got work, who did not probably get work. The point I'm trying to draw your attention to in this figure is to say, this is an example of how we were talking about random assignment. And random assignment was purely sampling. Are we together? It is purely what? Sampling. Now, do we have to do any sampling for impact evaluation? You're doing an impact evaluation. Yeah, we talked about all the methods we learned yesterday and the day before. They all include talking to people. Are they not? They all include talking to people. How do you draw those people? So the question I'm asking here, do we have to do any sampling for impact evaluation? Someone asked the other day online that how big the sample should be between control and treated group. Should be the same? Should they be different? I think today, I don't know whether she's still online, is she? If she's still online, I'll be able to answer that question. I asked her to pause until we get here. So here is the sample. The question, does the evaluation sample have to be sampled from a larger group? Does the evaluation sample have to be sampled from a larger group? Does it? Why? External validity, remember? External validity. Okay, if we were to do that. But in some cases, do you really have to sample for an impact evaluation? What if we are dealing with a small sample? Do we have to sample? Yeah? What if this is the sample I'm going to deal with? If it's a class, do I really have to sample? So sampling or not sampling is contingent on many things, right? Okay, again, context always defines whether you need to sample. And if you need to sample, then you're going to learn the tools of how to do so. So this is another example. This is a targeted population, trying to emphasize the point. If you're to sample, this is how you do it. But if dealing with a small sample, small number of the targeted group, you don't have to sample. You just go directly and start doing a random assignment. Who goes to control group? Who goes to treated group? Are we together? Are we together? Okay. Do we have to sample for an impact evaluation? I've answered this. The answer is not necessarily. And remember, we sample when it is not feasible to collect data on a larger group, right? For the reasons that you said, it could be costly. Why would I want to survey everyone in Nairobi while I could draw a random sample that is representative of people who live in Nairobi, that characterizes people who live where? In Nairobi, depending on different clusters, whether they're living in Kangemi, whether in Lavington, whether in Karen, whether in Muthaiga. You just draw a sample that is representative of people who are living in these places to characterize what Nairobi would look like. Are we together? Are we together? If evaluation sample is already small, you don't need to sample. If obtaining and analyzing data for all is not expensive, no need to sample. Okay? If you could equally have a bigger population, but if collecting data is free, there's no cost. Well, the bigger the sample, the better. We know that. Laws of large numbers, right? The bigger the sample, the more accurate your results will be. So if it's free, why not? But for the reasons that we mentioned, sometimes we don't do that for cost reasons. It takes a lot of money to do sampling. It takes a lot more money to do census. Billions and billions of money are spent to do census. And that's why countries, they don't do it every day, every year. They do it after 10 years. First, they account for the fact that population needs to grow after a certain period of time, right? So 10 years is good for doing census, but it is also because it is costly. In developed world like America, they have shorter periods, maybe 2-3 years. The Bureau of Statistics in the US, they do collect, I think, every 2 to 3 years. And because they're also advanced in the way they collect their data, they don't have to do physical. In Norway, they collect data using what? People's information, because it's a population of what, 6-7 million people, and their services, public services, are 99% automated. So it is easy to know who is who through their information, maybe tax returns. They know who is who, right? Because they know information about families. And that's the beauty and the beauty of doing automating public services. In Denmark, where I used to live, in Finland, everything is automated. Even anywhere, I get sick here, I see a doctor, I get a prescription, I can get dawa from any of the pharmacies in the country. They just ask you, so where would you go and pick it up? I pick it up from somewhere. The moment you give them what they call CPR, your residence card, they run it, they can see you. Anywhere in the country, you can go and collect your medicine. Are we together? It's because they have advanced. And because of that CPR, it's attached to you and your family, and you're mapped with your doctor. So you have a family doctor. So they know in this household, how many people live here, how many children are here. You understand? Every other month, when they send children upkeep, which goes to the mother, not to the father, you know, children upkeep, whatever, the mother is paid because I was a civil servant. They know where it goes, and they calculate the square meters of the house. How big is your house? How many children live in that house? They know. And if there's a change, if you give birth, there's another child, and if that child is born in Denmark or in Finland or Sweden, they are automatically added in the system. Are we together? If a child leaves the country and you do not notify, it's a criminal offense, because you get money that you shouldn't receive, and they're very serious about it. If anyone comes and lives in that house, because they've already mapped, if someone comes and stays with you, you need to notify immigration, because it affects the benefit that the family gets. If you're 5, if you're 3, now you're 5. You get what I'm saying? I had friends visiting over, I got into trouble. I said, who are these people? Because they put their names on my address. The moment they add another name on address, somewhere system picks, beep, beep, beep. And then this guy's Danish payment, they called me. We are seeing there's another guy here. Who is this guy? And we have released payment to your family about this. You are required to return by law. So I had to go and explain, oh, this person was visiting, he just used my address. Ever since, no one used my address. You get what I'm saying? So because the systems are so advanced that everything is connected. And that's why if you do something fishy in Europe, they can easily nab you because technology is very connected. They know everything about you, what you do, how you do, where you are. They can take in your, of course, Kenya and other countries in Africa are going towards that direction. Partly because to ensure the security, but also because governments like to have control. And that's why in Western countries, there's a lot of pushback on freedom of speech, because if you truly let government control information, they can have a lot of information. Okay? Well, we're not talking about government. I was just trying to draw attention on sampling. Yes.
Morning, everyone. So I think more or less like a clarification on this slide. Do we have to do sampling on impact evaluation? So the answer is no, yes, because based on the process that you've gone through, you're already working with a sample, right? Because we have the supply side, and we're now transitioning to the demand side based on what we learned yesterday. So I think irrespective of how big our population, which in this case is a sample, actually, we do not need to do any sampling at all.
Yes, in that context, it's very context specific. I want to put caveat there. Yes, but under normal circumstances, if you're designing a new project and it affects many people that want to do an evaluation on hustler movement, maybe a policy on hustlers, right? It cuts across the board. If you say you don't want to sample hustlers, how many hustlers are in Kenya? There are many, right? Eh? So in that case, you have to be, and they're different, they're scattered all over the country. There are those in different counties. How do you ensure county representation? How do you ensure this? You know, otherwise you have to go to all hustlers in each county, which is billions of money. You would rather take that billions of money instead of collecting data, just give them and save their lives, right? But in some instances, as he describes, maybe you're already dealing with a predefined sample, okay? But then you also have to think about, which is my next slide, you need to have to think about, okay, if you're already dealing with a predefined sample, what about external validity of your results? So suppose this is a predefined sample. How representative is this sample of the bigger population, okay? Very important to think about that. You can do a very good evaluation and you can achieve internal validity, okay? But you might not necessarily achieve external validity. There's one reading that you need to do, why external validity is important. And I think tomorrow, they've put together quite a number of lists of readings that you need to do at your own pace. And one of them is precisely discussing why sampling and external validity is very important, okay? Especially in randomization setting. I would encourage you to read all the links because they really draw, some of them are heavier with a lot of math, but some of them are very insightful, especially after this course, you're thinking of designing your own survey, doing your own evaluation. I've drawn your attention to quite a number of links where these methods and approaches are now standardized across the globe. So you'll be on the frontier of where the knowledge is. You're very lucky.
There's a question online
Yes.
from Salome. Is there a statistical minimum number in cases where a sample is already small? And in which cases does census apply?
Okay, so in economics, if you want to write a good academic paper and get it published, usually the rule of thumb is at least 500. Sample size should not be less than 500. In other instances for evaluation, for example, I've seen instances where sample is 300 to 400. The problem with smaller sample, and because of possibility of biased estimates, you might want to think of other statistical approaches, what we call non-parametric approaches. which deal with small samples. Are we together? So in your estimation, and there are methods that are being developed that you apply non-parametric ways of thinking. Parametric ways of thinking is how you specify, okay? Non-parametric way of thinking is that you look at the data, how the data behaves, and you impose structure on the data based on how the data behaves. Now, most in statistics and economics, they would require you to apply non-parametric approaches for finite samples, small samples, to sort of try to make sense. But to be on the safe side, the rule of thumb usually is at least 500. So if you get 500, that's good. 500 individuals of your sample size, but it varies. Yeah, I've seen studies, they have 300, 200. In fact, some of these macro level type of studies, they even have 100 because the unit of analysis is a country. How many countries? Can you get 500 countries? There are no 500 countries in the world. And that's why you see sometimes they have now, to increase the sample size, you have what we call panel, because now you have one country observed over 20 years. If you have 20 countries, that's 400 observation, 20 by 20. Are we together? Yes. So it could also be, if it's cross-sectional, at least 500, but if it's time varying type of data, which you're observing the same unit across time. I'm observing you today, I'm observing you tomorrow. So if I'm gonna observe you for 30 days, so I have 30 observations. And if I have 30 of you, that's 30 by 30, which is what? 900. Are we together? So your sample gets bigger. So there are so many things to think about: cross-sectionality of the data and time panel nature of the data. Well, I won't go into the econometrics of those things, because in each of these, there are different tools of how you can go and do the estimation, okay? Because whether it's balanced panel, whether it's unbalanced panel, there are also some statistical diagnosis that you need to learn how to do, which is what we learn. For those who are doing PhD in economics, those are the fundamentals that you learn. For cross-sectional data, there's also a way of how you treat cross-sectional data and how you derive inferences from them. But that's not part of this conversation. What I want you to understand is, why do we do sampling? How do we do sampling? And we will talk about hypothesis testing in case of randomization or impact evaluation more broadly. But more broadly, it will help you across different disciplines, because what we'll discuss today on how to do hypothesis testing is exactly what you do in any other discipline. The thinking, the approach is the same. So it's good for you. We will talk about all of those things, okay? But for now, let's ground ourselves with sampling. Okay. So we don't have to always sample, but we need to worry about the size of this group. So if this size is too small, what does it mean? Exactly what I just said, right? That if you're dealing with, if you want to do a study on Hustler movement, on Hustler Fund, and how it impacts young Kenyans, obviously you can't survey all of them. The group is big, you need to do a sample. But if you're doing a study on maybe a certain group, infants who were born in the last 1 week in Kenya, perhaps there will not be many, right? Or infants who were born during New Year Eve. How many people are born in New Year Eve? If you go to statistics of birth and death, they probably say, oh, there are only 200 or 100 across the country, right? Yeah? Now, in that case, then, the sample is small and you need to think about it. Again, context always dictates how big, how small your sample should be. What I'll teach you is the methods and formulas on thinking about how can I precisely determine the sample. And we'll talk about that on power analysis. And that goes hand in hand with hypothesis testing. How do we test hypotheses? Okay. Type 1, type 2 errors. Do you remember? Yes, we are going to talk, and today I will demystify for you what is type 1 and type 2 errors. Okay. So again, this I repeated this slide. You have a full population with the Matonyas. You remember our friends Matonya? They are there, and then from there, what happened? We want to draw an evaluation sample. We can't study all the Matonyas in the economy because there are many. But we all know that a sample of these Matonyas to here will help us if once we analyze this, it will help understand the entire population, right? That's exactly why household surveys are done, okay? So we have a few Matonya who are randomly selected into evaluation sample. What did we do again? We took a dice, threw a dice between treatment and what? Control group. Again, they were randomly what? Assigned. Okay? They were randomly what? Assigned. All of that is sampling, basically, because you are sampling from a group so that you can get a few there, a few there. Okay? And what did we say? From here to here gives us what? Internal validity. From here to here gives what? External validity. Are we together? Are we together? Okay. Can I take this phone call? This is urgent. Just a minute. Hello. Morning, how are you? Yes. Oh. Okay. Oh, okay. So I mentioned here we have external validity. Here we have what? Internal validity. Apologies, those online, for a small disruption. It was important. Okay. Are we together so far? Is it clear? Good. So before we go into the sampling, now I want to introduce some of the key terms that will be keep coming, okay? So that I prepare your mind. What are the key statistical sampling? One of the first key statistical concepts I want you to know is sampling variation. Okay. What is sampling variation? So let me give you an example of a very good sampling variation. I take a dice. Right now, I draw a sample. I want to measure height in this class. Okay. I take a dice. I'm going to ask some people to stand and then someone to measure their height by eyes. Okay. I take a dice and I randomly sample this row. Can you please stand? Just please stand so that people can understand. Let's see the average height here. What would you say? So if you take the average height, she's the shortest, second, maybe they're equal. So let's say 5'5", okay? 5'6", plus hers 5'5", let's say 5'4", average, because she becomes out as an outlier. That's the first sample, okay? 5'4", please sit. I draw another sample that constitutes 3 people. Our brother from South Africa, please stand, Mercy and Jane. You need to stand. So if he stands, those 3, the first one we got was 5'4", right? Now with that, what do you think the average would be? Probably 5'8". Are we together? Are we together? 5'8". The first group was 5'4". Now we have drawn another sample, we get 5'8". Okay? Please sit. What are we learning here? That's sampling variation. The more you draw sample and replace, the more you draw sample, there won't be the same. There will be variation between one sample to the other, okay? So variation in estimate due to the fact that we do not sample everyone in the population. Because of randomness, the first group I picked this, I got 5.4. Because I'm doing randomly, there's no chance I'll draw the same group. I'll draw another group. Another group will be slightly different from the first group. And the statistics, the mean, the average would be what? Different, okay? The difference between the 2 groups, we call what? Sampling what? Variation. Are we clear? Good. What is the standard deviation? Now, in the first group, we had an average of 5.4. But if you compare her height and her height against the mean, you'll see she'll probably be closer to the mean, she'll be very far from the mean, right? The closer you are, the standard deviation is small. The farther away you are, how much are you deviating from the average, from the mean? Are we together? So standard deviation, or sometimes we call variance. Standard deviation is the square root of variance, right? So variance is a measure of the standard deviation estimate and is related to the sample size and standard deviation of the underlying population. Sorry, a measure of dispersion of the underlying population. Dispersion from the mean. How much do you deviate from the mean? How far away are you from the average? So the farther away you are an outlier. Okay. What kind of a sample do you need? Do you need a sample that is dispersed with a large standard deviation or small standard deviation? What does it mean? Are we together? I hope those who did not statistics, they are following now. If you're not following in this class, my friend, you'll never follow anywhere else. Okay, I'm trying to demystify statistics, make it very user-friendly. Because sometimes they used to scare you. Statistics, do you know standard deviation? How do you calculate? Just, it's very easy. What is the standard error? We'll talk about this. Standard error, a measure of the standard deviation of estimates and is related to the sample size and standard deviation of the underlying. So if you know standard deviation, so standard error is essentially standard deviation divided by what? The sample size. How big? In other words, you are spreading your standard deviation for each unit of the sample size. It's called standard error. We'll come to that. When we're talking about it, you'll understand. Confidence interval. Confidence interval. Confidence interval in statistics, things can happen by chance. But we also have to have confidence, the extent to which we can believe. Remember, in statistics, you draw a sample which is a representative of the population, meaning the mean of the sample needs to be close to the mean of the population for you to say there's a representation. But in some cases, because we are estimating the mean from the population mean, in Kenya, we know the average height in Kenya maybe is 6. Let me give an example. That's for the entire population. When we draw the sample, we might probably get 5.6, right? So the difference from the sample statistics, sample mean to population mean is 0.4. Are we together? Now, because of the possibility of sampling errors, remember, as I said, the more you draw sample, you're drawing different people, you're likely to get sampling variations, okay? Sampling variation essentially also says there could be sampling errors in the process of drawing the sample in one way or the other. Now, in that case, you need to have confidence. And I'll talk about confidence interval when we talk of type 1, type 2 error very shortly. Confidence interval, the confidence with which that, okay, if there's no chance, this is the likelihood that from the population, we're going to draw a sample that is close to population mean. Okay, most often we use 95% confidence interval. 95% confidence interval says we only have 5% chance that the occurrence of this sample mean is by chance. Are we together? Is by chance. Other than that, if it's a model you've estimated, it's driven by the model. Are we together? We'll talk about that. Okay, and you'll understand what does confidence interval mean. Okay, so usually it's 95%. Conservative is 99%, which are very restrictive. And that also, if you have a bigger sample, conservative 99 should be, and the level of precision becomes much more credible, because 99% confidence interval, you're saying if you're estimating the impact of your intervention, you have 99 confidence if the impact is positive, that truly that impact happened. Are we together? In other settings, people have done what we call Bonferroni correction, where now it's even more strict here. And I don't want to get into that. Okay, it will confuse you. You don't need to. Let's come now to the real deal, power. And now that you have this concept, you understand sampling, right? We are doing power analysis. My goal here is, before we do power analysis, we need to understand hypothesis what? Testing. You always say, hypothesis this. Can you test the hypothesis? Multiple hypothesis testing. What does it mean? Today you're going to learn it. Okay? Okay? Are we together? Are you ready? Are you ready? Eh? Are you ready? Are you ready? Okay, let's see. Online, are you ready? I'm gonna start the journey. Okay, very funny. Whenever I teach this is the most enjoyable part of the course that I usually like to teach. It's very intuitive and very logical. Okay? When we talk of power analysis, remember I said, so essentially is how big my sample should be. That's what power analysis is all about. Should it be 10? Should it be 20? Should it be 100? But how we draw sample is contingent on many things. Okay, so statistical power analysis and statistical power, they are similar. Statistical power is the ability to reject the hypothesis that the program does not work when it really does. So in hypothesis testing, you usually have null hypothesis. Can I get a pen? We usually have null hypothesis and what? And what? Alternative hypothesis, right? So if you say I am tall, that's my null. Alternative is what? The reverse, right? I am short. So we have null and alternative hypothesis, right? Okay. Statistical power is the ability to reject null, to say no to null, that the program doesn't work when it really does. Null language is always very confusing, right? We usually frame it in the opposite. So for you to understand it, let's take this. Consider a null hypothesis where program does not increase test score. That's our null. Program does not increase what? Test score. If we reject that null, what does it mean? Program increases what? Test score. Are we together? Good. Now, but there are two things. As I said, there's sample and there's true population parameters, right? There's true state of the world, which we are trying to estimate. But because of financial constraints, we can't go and study everyone. We have to rely on the sample to draw inferences of the true state of the world, right? The population. So let's look at the column as the true state of the world. And we have two scenarios. Scenario number one, program does not change test score. Scenario number two, program increases test score. What does this column represent? This one. The program is working. This is the column, right? Are we together? Are we together? Nataka niende slowly so you can appreciate what we're going to do. After that, I'll be running like crazy. Okay? So this column represents that program is what? Is working. Here, program does not change the score. That means the program is not what? Mark these 4 cells very carefully. Okay. Our null is what? Program does not increase test score. Okay. Here is the estimate, because across column is the true state of the world. But as I said, we can't get the true state of the world for several reasons, right? So we draw a sample and we use the sample to estimate the true state of what? Of the world. So across row, so it is hidden here, across rows is the estimate that we can work with. Across column is the reality that we don't have control. This is what we can work with. So the reality about test score in Kenya is, if you start all young Kenyans, you'll know their test score. Are we together? We will know their test score, but we can't start all of them. We want to know, we want to make sense of the intervention on test score, but we not by giving everyone. We are giving a sample, and we want to relate the estimates that will come from the sample to see to what extent they are true representative of the population. Are we together? So across column is the true state of the world, which we don't know, or we know, but we can't estimate. To proxy that true state of the world, we need the sample. So across rows, what do we have? Is the estimate we can do. And there are two things when we do the estimate. We can either find out the program is working or the program is not what? In the true state of the world, the program can also work or cannot what? Are we together? So here we have program does not change test score. Here program increases test score. But this is the estimate of the reality of the true state of the world. And what do we have on this row? Is exactly like this column, right? So in this cell here, this is where the program is working. Are we together? In this cell here, the program, we argue on this cell, we argue that the program does not work, but truly the program what? Works. Okay? In this cell, we know, we estimate that we conclude that program does not work and it truly doesn't work. Are we together? In this cell, we argue that the program increases test score, but in reality it doesn't. So this is false negative, this is false positive. Are we together? You have heard of false negative and false what? Are we together? Online, are you following? This is how I'm going to demystify hypothesis testing. From today, no statistician should scare you anymore. It's not that magical. If you used to hear false negative, false positive, and you're like, what? What is that? I remember the other day I went to the US Embassy for visa. And the guy, you put your things, they scan on the machine so you can enter the embassy, right? So I put my wallet. The guy keeps seeing something on the screen. So I go and said, no, you can't go, sir. Put back your wallet. I removed everything. He keeps seeing something. Then I said, that's false positive. The guy was like, what? I said, your screen is showing you false positive. I said, no, sir, what is that? My wife was like, all right, don't get into that. Just cool. Because I was a bit irritated, and I'm telling him it's false positive. So we removed the wallet, we removed everything, and it is still showing something. Then I said, your machine has virus. Eventually they let me in. False positive. So when do we have false positive? When we argue that the program does not work, okay? While actually it's what? When we conclude. And here we have false negative. When we say the program increases test score, we tell policymakers that it increases, but in reality, what? Is it false positive? Is it false negative now? Let's see, we're going to get there, okay? But I want you to appreciate what I'm trying to say. Does it make sense? Okay, so let's see. Now we know these cells very well. In this cell, we believe program works, but when we estimate, we find that it doesn't work. In this cell, we hope evaluation will confirm that the program works, but in reality, the program doesn't work. Are we together? And in this cell, if program works, we want to maximize the chance that the evaluation says it will what? To work. Are we together? And here, it doesn't work, and we find out it doesn't work. So here, there's no worries. Are we together? Does it make sense? Are you all following? Good. Good. So remember, we want to reject the null. Our goal is to prove that the program indeed increases what? Test score. So the question is, where in these cells are we able to reject the null? Can we reject it here? Can we reject it here? Or can we reject it here? How can we reject it here? Okay? Are we together? I want all of you to pay attention. This is very important. So let's see. Remember, our null is what? Program does not what? Work. Here, do we have an ability to reject the null? No. Because our null says project does not increase test score. When we do the estimate of the world, we find out that indeed it doesn't. So we accept the null. Are we together? Are we together? The program confirms that indeed the program does not increase what? Test score. So we don't have an ability to reject the null. Here, we correctly reject the null because the null is program does not increase test score. But when we did the estimate, the intervention, we find out that it increases test score, which also matches the reality, right? So here we correctly reject the null. Are we together? Are we together? I could have used statistic symbols to just explain that. But I'm using words. So those who like to write, they can follow. Are we together? So these two cells, no issues here. We have here. And what does it say here? This one, program increases test score, but the reality is it does not change test score. So evaluation says program works when it what? Program works when it what? Now, is it a false positive or false negative? Is it a false positive or false negative? Yeah? So when you hear type 1 and type 2 errors, they fall between these two cells. Did you hear type 1 and type 2 errors? You have ever heard, so which one is type 1, which is the type 2, we are going to find today. Are we together? Okay. So let's see. So what did you say here? Is this false positive or false negative? This one. Are you sure? False positive. Because you are saying the evaluation has you have concluded that it works, but in reality, what? Doesn't work. So you have done, it's like if I've tested you and I say you have HIV/AIDS, while in truth, you don't have HIV/AIDS. I've just caused you massive panic, but it's a false positive. Remember when they were saying about COVID tests? You go and get tested, and I tested in Tanzania, they say you are negative. You cross border to Kenya, they say you are positive. Remember the stand of our countries used to have, Kenya and Uganda. You go to Uganda, from Kenya, you have your certificate. Of course, people used to buy those things, right? But if you are truly tested here and it shows you are negative, and then you cross border, it says you're positive. They conclude what you have is a false positive. And that's where the mistrust between governments started. Are we together? EAC had to intervene, the Minister of Health in East Africa, so that we can trust tests. So that's now, if I go to Tanzania or Uganda, I just show my vaccine certificate from Kenya. But if you go to Rwanda, they'll say, we need to test you. They used to test until recently they removed. But before that, you land, even if you have a vaccine, you have to go through, they test you. They have to confirm for themselves, okay? So here, you argue program doesn't work, but program works, while in reality, what? Doesn't work. And here, you argue that program doesn't work, but in reality, what? So here is the false negative. Are we together? Here is the false negative. You're saying, hii kitu haifanyi kazi. But the truth is, it does. How often have we made such mistakes in policy making? How often? How often have we made such mistakes in policy advice? And how often we've made type 1 error, false positive errors? We say this does work. But when it goes down, it doesn't what? It doesn't work. Okay? So let's see. How does that look like? Sorry. So here, we don't have problem here. We don't have problem here. These are clear. Everyone is clear. Are you following? Here and here, no problem. So here we say it is what? Type 1 error. False positive. We argued the program works, while in reality, it doesn't work. So you've done your evaluation, you've done your analysis, and you realize, hey, the program works. But the truth of the matter on the ground, it doesn't work. Perhaps because of sampling, and that's why we are studying sampling, okay? Here, we say evaluation says program doesn't work when it really works. Okay? When it works, okay? What do we have there? What we have here is type 2 error, which is what? False negative. So when we are doing evaluation, what do we want to maximize? What do we want to minimize? Type 1 or type 2 error? Okay, good question. I'm going to ask again. When we are doing evaluation, what do we want to minimize? Type 1 or type 2 error? Type 1 or type 2 error? Yes. How many are saying type 2? How many are saying type 1? How many are completely lost? Eh? When we are doing, I'm going to ask again, when we are doing evaluation, which error do we want to minimize? Who, if you say type 1, I want to give you a mic. And I want to hear from online before I give the answer. Yes, let's start off with online today.
Anyone online who wants to respond to that, raise your hand. Caroline?
When we are doing evaluation, which type of error we want to minimize? Type 1 or type 2? Is it okay?
Type 2.
Okay, go ahead.
Type 2.
Why?
Because you're really carrying out an activity, or we've you undertaken a program, you have taken a step, and we want to know if it really works and prove that it, because, okay, we've made a treatment and our focus is on what has already been placed. So we want to really assess the type 2, not type 1 in my view. Thank you.
Did you hear that? Let's hear from the class. How many think it is type 1? If you think you're type 1, please defend your argument. You want to add on type 2? Why? Tell us.
You are accepting a false hypothesis, type 2. But with the type 1, I cannot say that it's good, but we should also try to minimize it.
Okay, that's good. It's true. We minimize it, and we will get to that.
We are rejecting false hypothesis, meaning that we can later accept when we discover that we rejected it.
Yes.
But
that's a bit too deep. Huh? You're getting too technical. Slow down. There are people are getting sleepy here. Never mind. I asked that a very simple question. In an ideal setting, suppose we don't have type 1. When we are doing a program, we want to demonstrate that the program, we want to reject the null. Yes? We want to be here in the true state of the world. We want to be here. But we are confronted with this risk of making this mistake. Are we together? Because if we are, of course, we want to be here as well, but this is only the case that we want to accept the null. Our target is to reject because we want to reject the null. The program null is phrased in a negative way, in negation, right? When we are doing the intervention, we don't want to show that it doesn't have an impact. We are spending all this money for what? We want to invest so that we can actually demonstrate impact. So if the null hypothesis says program does not work, essentially we want to accept the alternative, which is program actually has an impact on test score. That's our goal. So other factors remain the same. If we really want to demonstrate to the donor that you gave us money and that money has worked, we want to minimize the risk of accepting the null. And what is the risk of accepting the null? It's here. Are we together? What is the risk of accepting this null here? Is type 2. And that's why in the definition of statistical power, what did I say? Let me go back. What did I say? Statistical power is the ability to reject the hypothesis that the program does not work when it really does. Now, if we come to this cell, here, type 2, we come to type 2, right? Type 2 is actually the risk of us not rejecting the null. So it's a probability. So let's say we have a chance of 10%. We might not reject the null. What is the statistical power? 1 minus 10%, 90%. Are we together? We will come to that. Okay? But I want you to appreciate type 1 and type 2 error. Are we clear? So what is the power? Power is the probability that you reject no impact when there is really an impact. So power is 1 minus type 2 error. Are we together? Statistical power, probabilities ranges between 0 and 1. So if the risk of you committing type 2 is 20%, the power, statistical power, the ability of you rejecting is 1 minus 0.2, right? Which is 80%. Are we together? To just make it very clear for you, and if you won't understand from this example, you will never understand statistical power ever again. Here it is for you. This is type 1 and type 2 error. So you're telling a man you're pregnant. What? And you're telling a woman she's pregnant, you're not pregnant. Are we together? So it's a false positive. You're telling me I'm pregnant. How do I get pregnant? Surely. I'll just punch you in your face. If you're a doctor, you tell me I'm pregnant. I have a big belly, but I'm not pregnant. Eh? So that type 1, false positive. Type 2, false negative. You are saying, you see this lady is pregnant and you're saying she's what? So we want to minimize the chance of not saying that this lady, so what's the opposite of her not being pregnant? That she is pregnant. So if the risk of saying, of committing this type error is 20% of the time, out of 100%, 20% of the time, we are likely to say you are not pregnant while you're truly what? Pregnant. What is the chance that we are going to say truly you're pregnant? Is 80%. Are we together? And that's the statistical power for you. Are we together? I've made it very easy. Okay, come on, if you can't understand this, there's no way you will ever understand statistics in your life. Does it make sense? Let me stop there before we proceed. Any questions? Any questions? Any questions? Any questions? Is it clear? Eh? So now if I start doing the math, you'll follow. Online, is it clear? So what happens if statistical power is too low? What happens? What happens if statistical power is what? Is too low? What happens if statistical power is too low? What happens? Here's an example. So we cannot distinguish a large effect from an effect of zero. And what we usually, when we say statistically different, statistically significant in statistics, what we mean is different from zero in statistical term. But when somebody says this is statistically insignificant, what it means, whatever you are estimating is not different from zero. It's equivalent to zero. It doesn't have to be zero, but it's equivalent to zero. That means it is statistically what? Insignificant. But if it is statistically significant, that means it's way far away from zero. Are we together? Because when you do central tendency measures and you standardize them, 0 and 1, you know, become your mean is 0, 1 standard deviation, something like that. So anything deviating from there. Are we together? Don't worry about that. So here's the case for you. Your boss, I am your boss. Here we have a conversation. Yeah? What was the impact of that project that you led? Yeah, I've given you money, you asked for budget, I gave you money. Yeah? So tell me in your performance, yeah? What was the impact of that project you led? And you start, you know, boss, it might have increased income by 200%. It might not have done anything. I can't really tell from the data. And I ask you again, how much did you spend on this evaluation? At that point, you should run away because you can't answer that question. So you're telling me I gave you 200 million, you don't find an impact and you're not sure? Perhaps because you had low statistical power. This is why it's very important when you're designing study to pre-think statistical power. Because statistical power, basically, if you define the sample size, and as I said, the rule of thumb is 500, but some people, they do statistical power analysis and they get 300. That means that sample will allow you to credibly reject what? Null hypothesis. Are we together? Whatever null that you're going to have in your study. So it can be 300. Yesterday, somebody said, should it be 200? Should it be? I can't tell. what we'll tell is using statistical analysis, statistical power to reject the null. So if you need 200 to reject the null and you can substantiate, go for it. If you need 1,000, but the larger the sample, the better the estimates. Are we together? The better the precision of your estimates. Is it clear? Online, is it clear? Are they saying yes or no? Or they're confused? Now we are going to go on the sample size. Someone asked on Monday, how big the sample should be? Now we are going to answer. And it's going to get a little bit messy. Numbers, brace yourself, pay attention, listen, okay? How big your sample should be? How big your sample should? And how large is large? Is 200 large enough? Is 300 large enough? Is 500 large enough? To answer how large is large, we have to look at this. Here are the questions. There are things we need to ask ourselves before we can answer how large is large. Okay? And I know this N is the sample size. It can be 10%, it can be 200, 300, 500. How large is large? Statisticians, sometimes they use Fisher equation, Fisher this, they have margin of errors, right? There are so many ways of thinking, but here we're looking in terms of what? Evaluation. Are we together? In terms of what? Evaluation. How large is large? So there are things you need to think about. You need to understand the probability of type 1 and type 2 errors. We talked about them, and that's why he was emphasizing we need to minimize both type 1 and what? Type 2 errors. Okay? And you'll see that in the calculation of the sample, you have that alpha is type 1, beta is type 2. That's what he was referring to. Okay? We'll talk about them. How similar or different is the population? This, see this row? It's called row. Remember, I talked about intra-cluster correlation. When I asked you the first day, should you sample less or more of the same cluster? Or should you sample less within a cluster, but more clusters across space? Are we together? I was referring to the second question. How similar or different is the population? Somebody said homogeneous groups, and we said if you have the same group, you're getting very little value information because they're similar. They're going to say the same thing, right? Those in Kibera, they'll tell you we don't have water. You go to the next house, we don't have water. So even if you have 1,000 of them, they'll keep saying we don't have water. You just have a clutter of information, no water, no water, no water. Relative to increasing Kibera as a slum, Kayole as a slum, Mathare, they'll tell you we don't have water here, we don't have roads here. So you see you're getting different nuanced information. Are we together? So how large, that question, how large of an impact is expected? Okay? In evaluation, we have a concept called MDE, minimum detectable effect. You need, before when you're designing your evaluation, you always have to think what is the minimum detectable effect your study can assume. Very important. And we'll talk about how do we use MDE. How do we know? For example, if you're doing a study others have done, okay? A study on youth in a particular county, they have shown impact is 20%. Another study on same subject in Tanzania, they've shown impact is 30%, right? Another, the same study in Rwanda, they've shown is 15%. Another study in the same county in Kenya, 18%. These are the effects that have been documented in other studies. You want to do a similar setup of study, you need to anticipate what the impact would be. I don't think you will come from nowhere and say my impact will be 100%. People look, you are crazy, right? So you need to be somewhere in the neighborhood of what others have done in a similar setup, in similar setting in different countries, and what did they find? So you need to have a hypothesis. If this study is done well, based on all this, the way they were done, if they're designed in the same manner, what should I expect to be the minimum detectable effect? So you need to study. This is why it's very important to do literature what? Review. Are we together? Very important. When you're doing literature review, you don't just do for the sake of reading. You are reading to contextualize your study. Are we together? So the minimum, how large of an impact is expected, you need to have it. These days, there's a software called Optimum Design, OD, which you can plug in, and we'll talk about it. It's just that I don't have in my computer. My other computer is home. I would have shown you. It plots even the graphs. You can play with different scenarios, cluster randomization, unit randomization, very easy, and it's a free software you can download. You can just do it for playing. Here I do this, plug this. Here is my alpha, here is my beta, here is my type 1, here is my type 2, here is this level of significance, and then it tells you in this scenario, you need to have this size of the sample. In Stata, the sums code has the same characteristics. It is very important, and I'll talk about in the next session about budgeting. When you're designing your survey, how big the budget should be. Power calculation is very important. You see now? When you're writing to a funder, how big my budget should be, because data collection is part of your budget. You can cost, numerators, wage, but how often are they going to interview? How many interviews they need to do? You need to know how big is your sample. So you need to always know power analysis. Are we together? It doesn't matter, even if you're in comms. Of course, power analysis doesn't apply for qualitative studies that do purposive sampling. I like this one. She looks beautiful. Can I interview you? This one looks rude. I can't interview this one. I'll interview that one. And that's why sometimes statisticians and economists dismiss qualitative studies, because sampling that is done in qualitative is very purposive. It is very judgmental. It is very subjective. And it can skew conversation in a certain direction. I can choose who I want in the sample. There's no randomness. And I can dictate. But sometimes such skewness, such subjectivity is also what? Important. Because if I want to talk to policymakers to understand the context of a particular policy, I can't just draw a sample of anyone. I have to target that particular person, right? If I want to target parents, I will have to do focus group discussion. Okay? Okay, in many cases, studies that I've done, and I'll talk about the female genital mutilation study we did in Kenya, I was able to draw a sample randomly of the young girls who were circumcised, who attended the ARP program, the Alternative Rite of Passage program. But I was able to draw a sample of parents, because we had a big list of parents. We could draw a sample and say, this is group 1, look for them. We do snowballing sampling. But if we were to interview children protection officers, there's only one. Who do I sample from? So in that case, key informant interview of the children protection officers was okay. If we were to interview police in Kajiado, in Loitoktok, there's one police station. Are we together? On the other study on child protection in Malindi and we did in Malindi and Kilifi, what is it? Parish. It was the podcast study. It's very predefined by who do you need to talk to. Are we together? So in such cases, can you draw sample? Can you do power analysis? And that's why qualitative study. Most students, they prefer qualitative because it is easier. You can control how big my sample can be. And you don't need to have a large sample because you're going deep. Are we together? If you're doing focus group discussion, if you're doing key informant interviews, if you're doing in-depth analysis, in-depth interviews, IDIs, you're going deep. You're not focusing on the representation, you're focusing on the context. Once you get the context, they're voice recorded, you get your NVivo, you load it, you start coding themes, you extract the patterns of who is saying that, who is saying that, who is saying that. And then you have your thesis. And you go, I'm an expert. Right. And the experts in that space, which now you appreciate why I say, when you are rounded, you've become a complete researcher. Because you see problem both from the qualitative side and quantitative side. Very useful. Okay? So in case of randomization, how large of an impact is expected? Are we together? And then what is the unit of what? Randomization. You should always ask if you're randomizing. Is it unit? Is it cluster or block? Remember we talked about these things? Are we together? Are you randomizing at individual level, at a school level, at a hospital level, or at a block, geographical block, or a community? Are we together? It matters. Because if you are doing clusters, how many clusters should you have? So much so that you are able to get a good sample that can help you what? Reject the null. Are we together? Are we together? So from today, don't just do, unless it's a purely qualitative study. If you're doing quantitative study, don't just draw a sample for the sake of drawing a sample. Draw a sample with a clear mind. You're drawing a sample that will be good enough to reject the null hypothesis I am studying. So you should have a hypothesis in the first place. If you don't have a hypothesis, just find a good Friday, go drink your chai. Yes.
Yeah, the context that you're putting is clear, demarcating the quantitative and qualitative. What would happen in a context of a mixed
method? Yes, good. And that's exactly why I want to talk about the FGMC study, because it's a mixed method. As I mentioned when I was discussing it, the first part was quantitative, right? The second part was to go and do qualitative work, and we triangulated. Triangulation. So there are different approaches for mixed method. I wish I could do that class, but that's another course some other time, okay? But one approach we used was triangulation. We are triangulating. We have done qualitative separately. We have done quantitative separately, and we are trying to see if the story comes together. There's triangulation. I can't remember the terms. There are about different 4 types of mixed method approaches. There's one you're starting with quantitative study. Then you're doing qualitative to confirm quantitative. There's another one you're doing vice versa. There's another one you're doing concurrently. Are we together? Are we together? In our case, we started with quantitative, and it was very independent. And then from there, we said, okay, let's design a qualitative study, separate from the quantitative, but related in terms of the issues we're asking. And then we analyze qualitative independently. And we looked at the story there and the story here. They're aligned, very powerful study. So we started triangulating for each hypothesis, each of the key questions, what we are seeing here, what does this mean in the quantitative difference in difference, and what does it mean in the qualitative? Does it match? It matches. So that means the study, the impact, the magnitude we are seeing here is justified. And here is the narrative, very powerful. In some settings, you might want to do them concurrently. And then you see if they tie together, triangulation, right? Are we together? I wish, okay, maybe we have, PASGA has a mixed method class. I am not an expert, but I know these methods very well. I wouldn't claim that I'm an expert, but I think if I'm given 1 or 2 classes, I'll claim I'm an expert. But it's just you have to read, understand, and contextualize things, right? But at least I know because I've used them, and that's why I'm able to explain. Are we together? So these 4 questions determine how large is your, are we together? So from today, if someone says you want to do a study, I'm writing my thesis, my master's thesis, and then I think my sample will be 100. If I'm your supervisor, I'll look at you and say, did you drink tea today? Yeah? I would expect you to come with some logical thinking, which means you have to invest time in reading, okay? So here we'll talk about N. Here is the standard deviation. Do you remember standard deviation I was referring to? Okay? Sorry. Here is the standard deviation. Are we together? Here is alpha, type 1 error. Here is beta, type 2 error. This is Z-score. Don't worry. All of this can be done on a computer for you. Here is D, the effect. Remember we used D? The minimum detectable effect, which you'll have to hypothesize from other studies. Here is rho. Rho is the intercluster correlation. How similar or how different are those, the population, is the population or the sample. Are we together? That's raw. Here, I will talk about it. And H is the number of clusters. So if you're doing random, if you're doing unit randomization, that means H is what? There's no raw. Are we together? Intra-cluster correlation, hypo. So this whole thing goes to 0. And so if you're doing individual randomization, this part, the second part here will not be there because raw will be what? 0. You'll only have this part. Are we together? We will see. Any question? I will explain this. Don't worry, I'll unpack them. Are we together? Are we together? Does it make any sense? Does it make any sense? Yeah? And why should we care about the size of the evaluation sample? That's the question that was asked the other day. Senio? Eh? Why should we care? Wajameni, are you following? Who is not following? Please ask if you don't. So why should we care about the size of the evaluation sample? Let's think about something simpler than program impact. What is the average height of women in Tanzania? So we do survey 1. That's the question we ask. Let us ask 5 people. And survey 2, let us ask 1,000 people. Because we want to draw average height in Tanzania. If we ask 5 people, will it give us a true picture of the average height in Tanzania? If we ask 1,000 people, will it give us a true picture of the average height in Tanzania? But Tanzanians are 61 million people. So how large is your sample? You get what I'm trying to get you to get your attention to. Very important to think about why you should care about the size of your evaluation sample. So here is the survey, okay? The 2 surveys. So survey 1, we are asking 5 people. The first person falls there. In this range, there are 2 people. In this range, there's 1 person. Here, there's no one. And then the tallest there's an outlier. So there's the shortest and the tallest. That's first sample, okay? When we ask 1,000 people, okay? Between this range, we have 70 people. In this range, we have 150. The third range, we have 125. The fourth range, we have 60, so 650. And the last one, we have 5. Which survey will give us an answer closer to the true average? Survey 1 or survey 2? Eh? Survey 1 or survey 2? Why? Huh? Why? Why survey 2? Why survey 2? One says good representation, another one? Say it louder. The sample size is a close relation because you have so many people. Here you have 0. Here you have only 1 person. So if you compare 125 against 1, I would rely on this than that one, right? Because at least you draw a sample of these heights from different people. There's some level of representation, no? Okay. So what am I trying to say here? The bigger the sample, the preciseness of your what? Estimates. So when you're doing evaluation, should you aim for a smaller or a bigger sample? Are we together? But the bigger has also some binding constraint, budget, time. Do you have it? We'll talk about risks to do with attrition, especially if you're doing a treatment. You're offering an intervention today, and then you want to follow them up a year down the line. If you have a small sample and there's attrition, people don't show up, don't appear in the end line, you're in trouble. So you see, there's importance of having a bigger sample. Because even you are, in fact, we'll see, you need to think to account for attrition. These days, they put a percentage of attrition in the sample, such that if 10% of this data, of this sample drops, I can still precisely, correctly, and confidently reject the null. Are we together? Yes.
Yeah, should quantitative one have more sample than qualitative, because qualitative could be more hectic because it takes a lot of time.
Yes, usually that's why I'm saying qualitative studies, you have so much flexibility in choosing the size of the sample. Usually it shouldn't exceed more than 50. Also because it's deeper, okay? Analysis of in vivo and conversation is not a job, my friend. Coding those things and extracting content and patterns of what people are saying, 200 people will just go nuts, okay? And that's why they recommend maximum, at least 50 sample size, not less than 50 for qualitative surveys. If you have more, I think some of the studies we did, we had more, it took longer to analyze. And the risk is because if you're doing, you are likely to hear the same thing over and over. So there's no value add. Are we together? But quantitative studies, you need a bigger sample. For statistics, laws of large numbers. The bigger the sample, the better the estimates, the more precise are your estimates. Are we together? Yes. So larger sample sizes yield the program impact that you are more confident of. Are we together? That's what I was trying to say. If you're doing an evaluation, aim to get a good sample, fairly good sample that can allow you to reject the null. Remember? Because then they'll give you confidence because of the laws of large numbers. From the laws of large numbers in statistics, the bigger the sample, the more sample parameters converge to population what? Parameters. The more closer they become. Because you have a bigger sample, that means if you estimate sample mean for that bigger sample, which is not far off from the population, that sample mean will be closely, the deviation of the sample mean from the population mean will be very small, okay? Which means you are correctly representing the sample as a correct representation of the population. Are we together? Here it is. Large samples help minimize what? Statistical errors. Large samples help minimize what? Statistical errors. Are we together? So when testing whether a program has an impact, two types of errors can be made. Type 1 error or type 2 errors. Are we together? I've talked about them. Researchers can limit the size of type 1 error by choosing a conservative significance level. So type 2 error, type 1 error is false positive, right? For you to minimize false positive, you restrict the risk of an outcome or program impact to happen by chance. Are we together? To happen by what? By chance. The standard rule is 5%, meaning, remember confidence interval? 95% of the time, you're confident that this program will have an impact. It's only 5% of the time that perhaps that impact will have captured by chance. We'll have false positive. Are we together? We'll have what? False positive. Now, what we usually do in statistics is to say, okay, the standard is 5%. But if we want to be very conservative, we'll say what? 1%. Meaning 99% of the time, we are likely to rule out what? False positive. Are we together? It's only 1% of the time. Are we together? In other very conservative settings, Bonferroni correction, you actually divide this by 2 on both ends of your bell shape. This becomes half, 0.0%, which is even more restrictive, meaning 99.95% of the time, you are likely to rule out false positive. Are we clear? And if you're, so we have to minimize that. That's what he was getting to. And of course, we have to rule out type 2. Are we together? And that's why in the formula, If you remember in the formula, I had this alpha. Alpha, we have to minimize the risk of us committing type 1 error. Are we together? And that's why it is assumed 5%. Here they applied Bonferroni correction. That's why it's divided by what? Because when you do the bell shape, remember the bell shape in statistics, you have two tails. Here is 0, you have the left tail and the right tail. So alpha is 5% on those small corners. So if you divide by 2, you're saying it's 2.5 on this side, the risk of committing type 2 error, type 1 error, and on this side, 2.5. You are spreading the risk because it's mirror. You know, the bell shape is what is the name? Symmetrical. Yes, it is symmetrical. Don't mind that. It's me now trying to make this point much more clear. Okay? I don't want to talk type 1, type 2 error. Now you know. So when we are doing analysis, his point that we need to be able to minimize both type 1 and we know type 2. Type 2 is a statistical power. 1 minus type 2 error, we have statistical power. But that does not take away the risk of not committing type 1 error. Are we together? So we have to, while we have type 2, we can control type 2 easily. We also have to minimize type 1 error. And type 1 error, conventional estimate, it's 5%. 5% meaning you have 5% chance of committing type 2, type 1 error. 95% of the time, you can rule out type 1 error. In a very serious estimate, 1%, meaning you are saying 99% of the time, you will not commit what? Type 1 error. You will rule out type 1 error. You only have 1% chance. Are we together? So we have to minimize both, his point. Level of significance. All of this is just now what I've been talking about. Okay? Level of significance is the probability that we will reject the null hypothesis when even if it is true. We have talked about all of this. Type 2 errors are also relevant for policymakers, being sample size the most critical component. Policymakers, those who are doing policy studies, very important. If no impact is found for an intervention, whether this difference was estimated with a large or small sample matters for interpreting the results. Are we together? You see now why you need the correct sample size. Because the interpretation of your results are contingent on whether the sample is big or what? Small. Are we together? And that's why people ask, hey, how big is the sample? It was 20 people. So you're drawing conclusion based on 20 people. Are you not? And that's why there's a tension between quantitative guys and qualitative guys. Quantitative guys, they have big egos saying, these quantitative guys are too shallow. How can you draw this with 50 people? And quantitative guys will come back and say, you guys, you're too pompous. You don't understand the context. We provide context. Tension, my friend. Tension. But it's part of how we grow. Power is 1 minus beta. Remember what I said? Beta is type 2 error. Are we together? So if this is 2%, 1 minus 2%, minus 0.2, that's 8%. Are we together? Conservative estimates, we always tend to assume power to be 80%, meaning we allocate 20% as a probability of us committing type 2 error. Are we together? Are we together? So if there is a measurable effect of our intervention, the null hypothesis is false, the probability that we will detect an effect or reject the null. We have talked about this. You already know now. What time is tea break? It's ready. Okay. Let's do this. Let's do this, and then we'll take 20 minutes break for tea. Okay? How similar? Oh, this is the second question. Remember, we had 5 questions. Do you remember? What was the first question? Type 1, type 2. We have dealt with that. Now, how similar or different is the population? Here we are talking of standard deviation. Remember standard underlying variance. How far are you off from the mean? The distribution of the sample. So you have interviewed, you have targeted children. Some of them are in Roysambu, Thika Road, right? Some of them are Kangemi. Some of them are in Kitengela. You see how spread that sample is? Right. It's very spread. But if I say focus only in Kitengela, it is clustered within one area. So the variance is small because they're within the same. Are we together? But if they're from different areas, that sample is widespread. And I want you to think about these two graphs. Look at them. Which one has less underlying variance, easier to detect difference, and can have lower sample size? So if the variance is big, what does it mean? Variance means the measure of dispersion, right? How far out are you from the mean? So if the variance is big, what does it mean in terms of sample size? And if there's small variation, if the variance is small, what does it mean? Should you have a bigger sample or a smaller sample? If variance is small, that means there's no difference between different units or under observation, right? They are not varying from each other, they're not too different. In other words, it's like you take me and another tall person. The variance is big. We are not similar. But if you take me and you take my brother here and you take there, we are not far from each other. So that one, they are almost similar. Variance is what? Is small. So do you need a small sample or a big sample? But here it says, if there's less underlying variance, it is easier to detect the difference. Okay? If we are the same height, and if we are different height, when can we detect the impact of an intervention? I will see. When we come back for tea, they're very interesting photos that I want you to make a sense of. So here you see you have three distributions. The first distribution, the second distribution, the third distribution. Look at this. This tells you, you can't see there. Let me see. The mean for the yellow, for the blue is 50. The mean in each of the distribution, the mean for the yellow is 60. For each of the three graphs. So which one is similar and which one is different? If you look at these graphs, which panel has similar underlying, because these are data points, right? These are individuals. Which one looks similar, which one looks different? Which one looks similar and which one looks different? You can't tell from the graphs. Just look at the graph. Don't forget about statistics. Which one is similar? Which one does not look similar? So I'll let you go drink tea. When you come back, we'll start from there. How about that? Okay. Let's go drink tea. And then after that, we come and pick from here. 20 minutes. Let's use 20 minutes. Okay. So I should start exactly at 11:20. Thank you.
Because you mean, because you mean, because you mean, because you because you mean, 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 because you mean so much to me, because you because you mean so much to me, 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 because you meant to ride this ocean, traveling in slow motion, paddling with no question, early morning with the sun, not your burning innocent, I try to be a good son, myself 100%, oh.
One, two, one, two. Mic test. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2.
Somewhere inside, I wish I reached that
1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2.
skyline, skyline. I wanna reach that skyline, skyline. I wish I reached that skyline, skyline. I'm gonna reach that skyline, skyline. Endless trouble to go through. They're strewn in the city. Daily struggle to be true. Betrayed authenticity. Poison well around the still. I will take another round. Oh, another ride until we take off from the ground. I feel it inside. I wanna reach that. It's somewhere inside. I wish I reached that. Reach that skyline. Skyline. I wanna reach that skyline. Skyline. I wish I reached that skyline. Skyline. I wanna reach that skyline. Skyline.
Okay. Let's see. We are back. Where are we? We were here. Okay. Those who are online, we were here. Among these three distributions, which one looks similar? The gist of this is, if you are underlying, if your population is different, what does it mean? Should you have a small sample or a big sample? If they are very different, and if they are similar, should you have a small sample or a big sample? We'll see, we'll answer that. But it's very important to think of how similar or different is what? The population. And then how large of an impact is expected? That was the third question, right? How large of an impact is what? Is expected. Now, that's a very interesting question. Let's see. If you look at these two photos, how many times do you need to look to see who is taller? Between the two panels, the left and the right. How many times do you have to look and say, this one is taller than the other one? Eh? The first panel, do you have to look any further? It's very obvious, right? So how large your impact should be in this case? Eh? And in this case, how would you tell between these two who is taller? How can you tell? Who is taller? So how many times do you have to look to see who is taller? Here you'll have to look very closely. That means to detect the difference here, to detect because they are very similar. Do you need a big sample or a small sample here? Eh? On this one. Do you need a small sample or a large sample here? Here you need a large sample. Because they're close to each other, for you to detect the effect, you'll need a bigger sample. Because otherwise they'll be similar, you'll get no difference. But in this case, on the left panel, how big your sample should be? Small or big? This one is so obvious that these two, the height is, okay? So you don't need a big sample to see who is taller. Even a small sample can tell you. Okay, how large is the impact? Are we together? Are we together? Are we together? So how large of an impact is expected? If impact is expected to be large, we can detect it with a smaller sample. That's what I was trying to say. The first panel. If we know that there's a difference of that magnitude, we don't need a big sample to detect the impact. Okay? Large difference unlikely to be due to chance. So in this case, remember we are ruling out type 2 error, type 1 error, right? If we are to rule type 1 error, that the risk of doing false positive, can you do here false positive? You can even impose 1%. Very conservative. It's very obvious. It's very unlikely here. You will conclude that this one, the lady is taller than the other guy. Very unlikely, right? But here, very unlikely you can make wrong diagnosis. In other words, false positive here is very high compared to here. Are we together? False positive on the left, on the right panel is high compared to false positive on the left panel. Are we together? Are we together? Are we together? Are we together? So to detect the impact on the first panel, you don't need a large sample. To detect impact on the second one, you need a large sample because they're not far off from each other. So what is the variance here? Is it smaller or big? The variance is small. So if the variance is small, what do you need? What's the variance here? Do you need a small or a large sample? Are you getting the gist? The logic here, okay? And this is very important, why we do baseline, balance check. Some of these things come into play here. So how large of an impact is expected? If an impact is expected to be large, we can detect it with a small sample. Large difference is unlikely to be due to chance. It's unlikely to be due to, what is chance in this case? Type 1 error. Are we together? False positive. We need a large sample to detect small differences. So if you have a small difference in your sample, the variation is very small, you need large sample. If the variation is big, you need a small sample to detect what? The impact. Are we together? Are we together? Are we together? Online? Are you following? Now, we have talked about how big your sample is. Let's take a detour, kidogo, a little bit. Let's talk about sampling strategies. Okay? Sorry. What underlies sampling strategies? What are the key questions when we think about sampling strategy? Which strategy should I use? Okay? When you're doing an evaluation and you're wondering, should I use a simple random sampling? Should I use whatever strategy you want to use? Which one should I use? What are the key questions? First, what is or are the outcome indicators? You need to ask yourself, what is or are the outcome indicators? You remember theory of change? The result side, the outcome. See, now they're coming together. Theory of change. What is or are the outcome indicators? Question number 2, what is the minimum level of impact that would justify the intervention? Remember in the progressor, they said if it's 20%, scale up. If it's $20, scale up. Remember, first day? So in this case, if you're going to do what is the minimum detectable effect that will justify what? The intervention. And I mentioned here examples of different studies. You need to benchmark it when you're doing sampling strategy. In other words, when you are inputting your parameters into the OD, the optimum design software, you need to have a sense of these variables. Are we together? Which then it will tell you once you plug in all the parameters, it will tell you the sample size should be this much, the cluster should be that much. It should be 20, 30, 100. It should not be more than this, or should not be less than this. What is the baseline mean and variance for outcome variables? What outcome indicators? You say outcome indicators, preschooling, health indicators, right? Years of schooling. What is the mean years of schooling? What is the variance of the years of schooling? You need to start those to understand the dispersion. Remember we said, if the variance is big, perhaps you don't need a big sample, right? If the variance is very small, that means you can't detect the difference. You need to start thinking of a large sample. Are we together? What is the reasonable level of power for the evaluation to be conducted? So, now, before you say we can do this evaluation that, there are a lot of things you need to consider, which is what I emphasized, the need to have teams of different people. You need to have a statistician, you need to have an economist, you need to have a social science, you need all of these people in the team. Very important. So what is the reasonable level of power? Do you remember what is power? Should it be 80%, 90%? The standard is 80%. What does 80% mean? It means the likelihood of us rejecting the null hypothesis. In other words, the likelihood of us not committing type 2 error. The likelihood of us not committing false negative. Are we together? That's power. Okay? And then ask yourself, it's evaluation and it involves randomization. Does the program create clusters? Remember the cluster, the row? Because if it creates clusters, remember that formula n blah, 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 and then row in the bracket h minus 1. It will apply. If it doesn't have that, I said the other part will be null because row will be 0, and we'll talk about it. Are we together? These are the key questions that should govern your sampling strategy. Okay? Let's try to answer a few. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. In fact, if you include clusters, there are other statistical considerations you need to have, and we will see. So it does. Clusters add another layer. I get it. So if it doesn't have, but you have to also think, if you want to exclude clusters, you have to think of spillovers. Remember the nightmares? Contamination. So you might want to focus on individuals, but then they will contaminate your study design. Then at that point, you need to think about, how do I get into clusters? So it's a catch-22 sometimes in the designing. And that requires careful thinking before. You don't want to be caught in the middle of the intervention and you realize, oh, we did terrible in sampling. Okay? To having clusters. Yes, yes. So you might choose not to have clusters for the several reasons, as you likely put. But you have to also take into consideration other possibilities. And what then would that mean? What are the effects of not having clusters? And what does it mean in your design? So it's very context specific. Are we together? But you need a statistician in the team to guide that decision, right? So it's documented and justified. So let's first, step 1, counterfactual mean and variance. Remember the question was, what is the question number 3? But we can start with counterfactual mean and what? Variance. We need to think about, we need to have an estimate of outcome of interest before the intervention. You remember when I was saying baselines? That's why we do baseline. That's why we do what? Baseline. We do baseline before the intervention. And the reason we did baseline was what? To do balance what? Balance check. And so we need to have an estimate of the outcome of interest before the intervention. And how do we get credible estimate? So sometimes you have not done the baseline, okay? If you have not done the baseline, you are designing the study, right? You're in the designing stage. You have not even conducted baseline. You are thinking of, what is my outcome variable, years of schooling? Where can I get data on years of schooling? Has there been any survey in Kakamega about years of schooling? Has there been any data in Laikipia about years of schooling? It doesn't have to come from you, but your outcome of interest is years of what? Schooling. Can I get data from other sources that will give me a sense of what is the average years of schooling? What is the variance years of schooling? Are we together? So previous household survey could be a good source. Administrative data and census data can give you a sense. When you are talking of average years of schooling in Kenya, how do I find out what's the average? If you go to demographic health surveys, which are nationally representative, you'll get it there, right? Because it surveys Kenyans and it captures information and education. If you go to Kenyan household surveys, you'll get it there. If you go to Kenyan census data 2019, you'll get it there. You'll have a sense across the board, what's the average years of schooling, okay? You can also get the same indicators from similar regions or countries, which have pretty much not far off from where? From Kenya is. For example, in East Africa, we are not far off from each other, right? Maybe if you don't have data on Kenya, you can draw data from where? Tanzania, from Uganda, from Rwanda. Are we together? You can also use some other good data sources. Demographic health surveys, I've talked about them. World Bank LSMS, Living Standard Measurement Surveys, LSMS is a good source. National Statistical Institutes. Here you're talking of household surveys, and other surveys that are being done. Educational surveys, they're also there, right? Ministry of Education conducts surveys, right? They have them. Are we together? Are we together? So you have to think of counterfactual mean and what? What is the average and what is the variance of the counterfactual of your control group? The only way to do that is to look for other sources. Very important in the design stage of your study. When you're thinking of something strategy, when you're thinking how big my sample should be. You need to ask yourself, how much will estimates of outcome indicator vary? So once you get the data, you need to estimate standard deviation as best as you can using other sources, the sources that we've identified, right? See now why I was saying you need to know standard deviation. Now, if I say standard deviation, you follow, right? Or you have forgotten already, okay? How much will estimates of outcome indicator vary? Estimate what? Standard deviation. And what does that variation mean? What does variation mean? More variation, more error in the estimates. If it varies too much, there's a bigger risk of what? Are we together? If variation is small, less errors. Harder to measure statistically significant effect if one exits, there's lower power. So higher variation also has implication. If the standard deviation is huge, it has what? Implication. If standard deviation is small, it has what? Implication. It has implication on power. Now, when I say lower power, you know what I mean. When I say lower power, I mean the likelihood of you ruling out false negative becomes small. While we want to maximize that likelihood, right? We want to maximize that likelihood so that you are not likely going to make a false negative mistake. Are we together? So when you have lower power, that means the chance of you committing false negative is also high. Are we together? Are we together? And then larger sample size needed. Are we together? So you have to understand, this is very important. You do diagnostics. That's why in econ, in statistics, when you're doing your present, you have to do descriptive for your data before you start analyzing, right? You do descriptive for your data to show the underlying distribution of the data. And what do you produce in the descriptive of the data? Average, standard deviation, standard error, variance, median, range. The key statistical parameters, because those parameters, they will tell you how dispersed, how skewed. In fact, in other cases, you have to do kurtosis, you have to do lower tail, you have to do all of those. You remember? Why do you think they're needed? They're not needed because it's fun to produce kurtosis. Okay? They are needed because they give you the underlying structure of what? Of the data. Are we together? So now if you go and read kurtosis, skewness of the data, it's not because statisticians, they want things funny or fancy. It is only because they help characterize the distribution of what? Of the data. Very important. So don't ever take for granted, my sample is 200, but what is the underlying structure? And then I'll ask you, can you produce summary statistics for this data? What is the mean? What's the median? What's the variance? What's the range? What's the minimum value? What's the maximum value? In what case, what's the kurtosis, measures of skewness of the data? Is it skewed on the left? Is it skewed on the right? And what does it mean? Are we together? I think from today you should love statistics. Huh? It's very interesting, it's very juicy. It's just that it needs to be taught in a way that it's not too scary with mathiness, right? It needs to be taught in a way it's very narrative, so that when you see the math, you just apply. Okay? How do we know minimum effect size? Remember we talked minimum effect size? Number 2. Minimum what? So what is the smallest effect that should justify the program to be adopted, or rather to be implemented? You can't just come and tell me, I'm a fund, I want to implement. How are we sure that your program would work? So if you want to convince me, you need to be able to have a sense of what is the minimum effect. If implemented right, we might be able to detect. Are we together? But how do you know that? So here it's fundamentally a policy question. Policy relevant or statistically significant? So in development discourse, sometimes it might be policy relevant, but it is not statistically significant. And in other cases, it can be statistically significant, but it's policy irrelevant. So the minimum effect you're targeting should have this balance. Are we together? Smaller the treatment effect we want to detect, we need more power. That means we need a bigger sample. Now, if I say more power, I mean bigger sample. I need more sample to rule out false what? Negatives. We need bigger sample size, and sometimes it is expressed in standard deviation. So this part, don't mind. The way we report some of these results, we scale them using standard deviation. And that's why if you read report, they say 0.5 point standard deviation of the mean, right? Essentially, you do everything as a ratio of standard deviation. It becomes easier to interpret. If you have read reports, they say, oh, this impact has increased by 0.5% standard deviation. Yeah? And you're like, what do they mean? You get confused because this is exactly what they do. So you can report in absolute terms and say it has increased by 20%. But when you compare with standard deviation, you are telling someone this impact, how much it diverges from the mean, from the counterfactual mean. Because if there's an impact, before the impact, the average mean is 20. Post the impact, it is 25. So when we are reporting percentage change of the impact, remember when I was presenting my study on China, I was putting percentage terms, right? Precisely that's what I was doing. I was comparing post-impact coefficient with pre-impact coefficient. The difference of the two over the pre-impact coefficient, it gives you the percentage change, the relative measure. So here, we usually report relative measure as scaled with respect to what? Standard deviation. So it becomes more relative. That when I say impact has increased by 0.5 standard deviation, meaning the size of the impact from the mean, and in this case mean is 0, it has diverted, is bigger in this magnitude, 0.5, 0.6, 1.2 standard deviation. And you can recompute because this is the formula. You just have to, if you have standard deviation here and here, you put there, you recompute the absolute magnitude. Okay? Not in standard deviation. Are we together? Don't mind math, but you are getting the key messages. Considerations in determining minimum effect size. Number one, think about what impact would matter for policy decisions. Remember that balance between statistical significance and what? If you want statistical significance, maybe you need to have a bigger sample. Okay? Policy relevance vis-a-vis what? Statistical significance. So what impact would matter for policy decision? You look at the current mean of outcome indicator. You look at the cost of the program vis-a-vis benefit it brings. You look at the cost of the program vis-a-vis alternative use of the money. What is it called? The last one, cost effectiveness, right? The second one is what? Cost benefit analysis. And the first one, you look at the average outcome. And if we are to intervene with this intervention, how much would we move the average outcome post the intervention? Are we together? And what is realistic? Effect sizes of similar programs done in other places. Remember, I mentioned that, right? Other studies, what did they find? Because they have to be realistic. You can't tell me the minimum size effect is completely, even if I read what others have done, I find it way off. What is so special? What's so unique? So this is very important because you have to contextualize your study for policy or for academic purposes within the literature of what others have done. And if it's far off, it will raise their eyebrows like, hey, this is a breakthrough. This is something that deserves a Nobel. Are we together? But we would expect that it should be confined within particular parameters because there's no new knowledge. Someone must have done it somewhere. You're just adding a little bit somewhere. Okay? And that's why in the literature review, we have to cite others. We cite others. It's not like listing literature. You write a narrative based on what others have done. It should flow. When I review, if I'm your supervisor, if you write a literature review chapter and you write like listing, I will just chase you. You will never go further. You need to write it as a flow, as a story. And it needs to flow within the context of your study. So when you're citing me, you're citing that, it flows. But I always say, hey, others, Juma did this, da, 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 and then there's another one. I'm not interested in this in listing of the, you could as well do it and then send it to me. But it needs to be contextualized. That's what good writing requires, okay? Are we together? You need to think about effect size of other programs with similar goals. Perhaps someone else is implementing a program somewhere. Perhaps someone else is implementing a program somewhere. And that's why in PASGA, we are setting up what we call PASGA Plus, people, learning, understanding, and sharing. Because most often what we know, master's students that we have in different 14 countries, in 14 universities in 9 countries, they don't speak to each other. So perhaps you're doing a study and someone else is what? He's also doing there. And you don't know. So PASGA Plus is envisioned to bring African scholars together in public policy and governance. Perhaps you are doing a study here, maybe someone else is doing, and you can collaborate and try to do comparative cross-country study. But there's no platform to know that. There's also data, you're looking for data. Maybe someone else has collected in a particular account, but you have no clue where do we put them. And that really limits African scholarship. If you go to Harvard, they have Harvard database. If you have access to Harvard database, you will see all the data and studies that have been done by American, European scholars in Africa. They have data they post there, so anyone can access. When I was talking of the paper that was debunked, the GDP to debt ratio, it's because data is available. If you go to American Economic Review journal, right now, all top journals in economics, you download the paper, you also see the data, you see the code. It's standard. It's part of replication, transparency movement. But for us as a continent, we need to enhance scholarship. And that's why if you look at publications, Sub-Saharan Africa is less than 5%. And this is helicopter researchers come and go. Professors here, they are looked upon as research assistant by just junior people in the West. And there's a lot of complaints. And now you see other journals like Larsen, they've started demanding that if you're doing research in Africa, you have worked with researchers, you don't just acknowledge them, put them as authors before your paper is published. But when we start sharing, when we start learning from each other. That's how we can amplify the voice of African scholarship. We can amplify the knowledge of African scholarship. We're lacking. And not that we don't have knowledge. We do. There's a lot of knowledge that's produced, but we are accused to be more of downloaders than uploaders. And it's true. We consume a lot of knowledge from outside than what they consume from us. And where do you think they do those studies? In Africa. Yes. The one with the cost of doing business. I was there at the time. The guy who flanked it, he was my boss, Paul Roma. I was there. But I'm recorded. I don't want to comment on something that will get me into trouble. Because I was privileged. I was a World Bank employee then. People have raised concerns on the data. Yeah? For statistical concerns that it was being skewed to push particular agenda. And Paul Roma, who was a Nobel laureate, I think in 2018, he was my boss. We used to have tea in the morning, go in the corridor, he would say, he shook us up big time, big time. Sometimes you can be very smart and you can be an arrogant freak. You know, very, very brilliant people skills. So he identified a statistical gap in the way the data was being collected, the methodology, because it was stopped for methodological reasons. That methodology was not consistent. And when people looked at the data, they toyed around statistics. On this year, it was like this. This year, you changed the questionnaire to this. This is going to produce different results, and then it favored. In some instances, it favored Chile. I think that's where the conversation was, and then later regimes changed, and then said, "Oh, this is American politics." So eventually, the bank decided to stop it for that reason, because then it was not credible anymore, and it influenced policy in Africa, particularly on investment decisions. When investors are coming to Africa, they look at the cost of doing business, right? And if the data was flawed, that means most of the decisions were misguided. Are we together? Well, that's as far as I can comment. I can't comment beyond that if I'm being recorded. Okay. Level of significance and power. We have talked about this. Determine the significance level. What is significance level? Type 1 error. We want to rule out type 1 error. We want to rule out what? False positive. Okay? Okay? It is usually what? 5%. I talked about it. And there's this statistics of, you remember in the formula there was a Z. That Z is 1.96. Okay? So if you put Z, and it was Z subscript alpha divided by 2, right? So Z 1.96, it's 1.96. If you alpha divided by 2 of 2.5, so you go on the table, you know those T statistics table. You look at Z column and it gives you the number. You plug all the parameters. Boom, you have your N. Okay? But these days, things have advanced. Determine the power we want. The power is what I said. The standard is what? 80%. What does 80% mean? The chance of you committing type 2 error is only what? 20%. Are we together? Now I can speak type 2, type 1, you know, interchangeably. You'll follow. Clustering. Okay? Clustering. Sorry. Just a second. There's a question?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
One is a comment on whether PASGAR can offer a course on statistics for impact evaluators. And
who's going to teach?
You, I'm sure.
I'm not a statistician. I'm an economist who happens to know a little bit about statistics. You can teach.
Then the second question is whether there's literature on impact evaluations that are done employing robustly and scientifically that can serve a basis for comparison?
There are many, but they need to go on econ development journals. There are plenty. Go to MIT, JPAL, IPA. There are many studies in different sectors, in agriculture, in health, in education, in microfinance, financial inclusion. Tons and tons of randomized control trials have been done. If you go to JPAL hub, they're only focusing on RCTs, randomized control trials. You see tons of studies that have been done in Africa and India. If you go to IPA, they're doing both. If you go to SIGA, people are doing studies left, right, and center in Africa, in Latin America, in India. Kenya has been overstudied. So there are many, but they are all largely econ-oriented type of journals or places, right? And development, public health, they're also quite a number. Health economics, health generally, they're quite a number. Education, especially education, there's quite a number. Agriculture, they're quite a number. I've seen some work in transport. If you go to the World Bank DIME, Department of Impact Evaluation, DIME, there are tons of studies. If you follow World Bank blog on development blog, they talk about, on weekly basis, they talk about impact evaluation, methodologies, new advances. There are tons. Subscribe, it's free. Okay? And you'll be on the frontier of where the world is, because it's very important. If you're left out, my friend, by the time you're going to learn, the world is actually, ooh, you're always catching up. You don't have to. You just, if you are curious and you have the energy, like the one I have, I know what are the new methods every single day. Every day, you know, you have to read The Economist, I have to read Financial Times, I have to read Harvard Business Review, I have to check my World Bank blogs, I have to read. You're constantly learning. What do you read every day in the morning? Nairobi Nini? Nairobi, what? That's that magazine, is it called? People News. People News. And you expect to be on the frontier of where knowledge is. My friend, wait there, keep reading. I challenge you. You really need to be, if you really want to know these methodologies and new things, you need to be in the right places of where things are happening. And you don't have to be there physically. These days, these things have, technology has made it very easy. So you can subscribe to some of the journals, some of the blogs, and people write. While you're sleeping and eating nyama choma, there are people who are spending time in the labs thinking, discovering new ways of thinking. If you want to learn about R, Stata, how to code, every week I get from Arab blog, new updates. There's this code that came up. There's that code that came up every week. Every week there's new innovation. In Stata, I used to have a friend of mine who is now the president in Colombia, president of the pensioners. He wrote a code, one of the very famous code in Stata. We were together in class, very brilliant guy, Juan. He said, you know, Anthony, I'm writing this code. And I said, no, put this one you can publish, get paid. And he wrote a code that you can probably have a software and click and write. Somebody wrote it. Somebody spent time to think. Problem of Africans is we delegate our thinking. We do not think. Others in the developed world, our colleagues, they spend time to think. Here, we don't think. We expect someone else to think for us and we take it and run with it. That's the problem. And that's why we're not moving. They spend time to specialize and focus and think. And that's how they discover things. They are not unique from us. They're not different from us. I taught in Europe, I taught in America. There are some people who are just as lazy. But God forbid, I don't want to say it. I remember one time I used to teach in Europe and I failed the entire class. They couldn't pass. Okay, half of the class. So you think you're not smart? You're way smarter than you know. It's just that we don't have confidence in who we are. If there's one thing colonialists did, is to take away our true identity of who we are. But I can guarantee you, if I can write a code, you can. If they can discover all these artificial intelligence, why do they have to come from them and not us? Why do you think China made it? They spent time, they went to their countries, they learned, they went back, they invested. Where are they now? Where did the Russians go? Why do you think there's these geopolitical tensions? You want to go to the moon? I will go to the moon too. I hope you watched that movie by that lady who was the scientific mathematician who wrote the geometric code of when they went to the moon, where should they land? What is it called? The hidden, I forgot the name. The three American black women who were during segregation in the US. And they're the ones who actually did the mathematical calculation of the, whatever went to the moon, Apollo, is it Apollo? Where should it land? She did it mentally. Machines, IBM machines could not. You should watch the movie. What do you watch? Oh, you just watch this. How do you expect to grow, for God's sake? Watch things, go watch nature, engage with scientific that will intoxicate you. You're like, what is that? Eh? Hidden Figures, yes. I love the movie. Have you watched Beautiful Mind? The way Nash discovered Nash equilibrium. It was in a bar. They were competing for a girl. The girl is beautiful. There are three men who want a girl. He was one of them. That's how he developed Nash equilibrium. He got Nobel laureate. You and me are here. You go to Milan and you start vibes. Hey, DJ, watch my friend learn. Yes. Huh? Beautiful Mind. Yes.
So taking us back to sampling, the sample size determination. So I see two things. So there is the conventional way of doing sampling, of sample size determination, and then we have sample size determination for impact evaluation, right? Now, all of them revolve around variance. Now, if I look at variance, the bigger the variance, in my mind, I think this population is heterogeneous, right? So they don't share a lot of characteristics. Therefore, I need a bigger sample as opposed to when I have a smaller variance. That is the conventional way, right? But when you come to impact, sample size determination for impact evaluation, it's the other way around, right? Yes. So the bigger the variance, the smaller the sample.
Because you want to detect the impact.
Because you want to detect the impact. But the smaller the variance, the bigger the sample, because you can't detect the smaller sample. So I think that is what I wanted to come out clearly.
Yes, yes, yes. Are we clear? Are we clear? He just decided to take us back. I think I was throwing stones on Nyumba ya Vioo. Huh? No, but seriously, jokes aside, statistics aside, sampling aside, as Africans, we need to think. The dependence syndrome, defeatist mindset does not move us forward. Young people are doing great things. TikTok, who discovered TikTok? Who are the great uploaders in TikTok now? People become fans in TikTok. Yeah. Influencers, they call themselves what? Influencers on a platform that was developed by someone else. Go develop yours and tell me you're influencer. Go together. I'm challenging you because it will take us to change our continent. It won't take anyone else. Clustering. Let's come back to statistics. Okay? Clustering. Okay, what does clustering mean? Remember, we talked to account for clusters, right? One of the questions, right, was on clustering. And your issue about whether do you need to have clusters or not. So we need to account for clusters. Sometimes level of intervention is different from the level where you measure outcomes. For example, intervention in a school, outcomes on students. Intervention in a village, outcomes on villagers. Intervention in a hospital, outcomes on what? Patients. Okay? Outcomes for all the individuals within a treatment unit may be what? Correlated, they may be similar. So if I am to take this class as one unit and I measure outcome of your understanding or you are defining impact evaluation, you are going to say the same thing because you look similar, you have gone through the same training. Are we together? You're all likely to define impact evaluation the same way. But if I take another class that I didn't teach, I could find differences. Are we together? Are we together? So we need to account for clusters. And what does it mean? Okay? For example, if it's a village, all villagers are exposed to the same weather. If it's patients, they all have the same doctor. If it's students, they all have the same teacher. And if teachers, they're all managed by the same principal. Are we together? If it's a household, you are raised under the same roof, in the same household, you are likely to behave the same because your dad and your mom, you'll mimic certain behavior. If your lunch is ugali and sukuma, you are all going to eat ugali and sukuma. Okay? But the other household, they'll be eating yamatoma. Are we together? So if you are raised in the same household, you are likely to behave the same way. So you are likely to be correlated. Are we together? You are likely to be similar. Why cluster is important? More correlation between outcomes within cluster. It leads to less information from units within the cluster. Remember the argument we talked about? Now the question for sampling is, should I add more of the same people in the same cluster, or should I take less of them and add more clusters? That's what I was asking last time, okay? And then it lowers power for a given sample size. Our ability to reject the null, our ability to not commit type 2, our ability to not commit false negative is small. Are we together? Are we together? Sample size estimates need to be adjusted for clustering. This is the point that you need to take home. Sample size need to be adjusted for what? For clustering. Oh, time is rushing. Today I forgot. Okay, we'll finish this. Whatever remains, we'll finish tomorrow. So here is an example. Clustering creates similarities. What do you make of the first panel photo? He's just by himself. Eh? There's no one else is sleeping. He's by himself. What about the second one? The teacher's in front is writing, everyone else is writing, right? It creates what? Similarities. Can you sleep in that class? Can you sleep here like the way he's doing here? He can't. Are you getting the message? Are you getting the message? This one does not require you to know statistics. This one is very straightforward. Are we together? So what does it mean? Power increases when number of schools increase. Pupils in the same school will be similar because school level factors are what? Are similar. They are exposed to the same environment, same curriculum, same teachers, same routine, same expectations, and so on and so forth. Bribon and Nairobi International School and what other international school? Cambridge, what is the other one? ISK, they're all international schools, but they're different. And that's why they have different prices. Some of them is called because of prestige, not because they're offering anything unique. Yeah? Right. If you look at the universities, you have UON, Strathmore, USIU, Kenyatta. Are we together? In UON, you'll behave the same way because you have the motto, UON, this, UON, that, and you're very proud. Kenyatta, they have the same also, but slightly different from yours, and they're very proud. Strathmore, they say, this is Gava schools. Come here. USIU, they have this, you get what I'm saying? So sampling more pupils does not provide more information. If I'm going to do a study in Kenyatta, and it's about Kenyatta, or it's about universities, and one cluster is Kenyatta. Should I sample more students in Kenyatta University or less and then go for another university? Or should I capture all my sample from Kenyatta University to talk about higher education in Kenya? Are we together? Are we together? So akin to asking the same person about average height of women in Tanzania multiple times, the one that we did, the 5 people and the 1,000 people. Are we together? Are we together? This is very important. Now, what we need, why are we talking about clustering? The question that we were trying to answer is, at what level should we randomize? Should we randomize at the individual level or at the cluster level? So let's see this example of 2 studies, and maybe the question that was asked on how big should the control and treated group be, right? Okay. So here you have individual 393, individual level, 393 in treatment and 393 in control. Okay. What's the total here? 786, right? Cluster level, you have 80 clusters each for treatment and for control, and 20 individual per cluster. What happened? Power went off. Oh, but this is on. Oh, this is on. This is on. Right. What? This thing was not working. Yeah, died. Yeah, it's working. All this time I thought I plugged in and they pressed on, so it was off. I'm not sure if people online are following, Jennifer. Just ask them to bear with us. Okay, so it's coming on. It stops when things are getting more nice. They lose the uhondo. They go uhondo. How can I do uhondo? Let's give it a few minutes. Wait to power on. Yes. Okay. Why don't we talk about that when we get to those sampling approaches? We'll talk about them. We'll come to that. Good question. Is it on? Are you plugging in the same? I'm not sure whether that thing is working. Sorry, it's just, maybe I can take questions while we are waiting for my computer to be powered on. If there's any question.
Caroline, let me allow you to speak.
While
Yes.
you're waiting for my machine to.
Go ahead, Caroline.
I forgot to charge it yesterday. It's up now.
Caroline, go ahead. Caroline Owade. And somebody also asks if we can get a practical example of sampling. Be patient. Caroline Owade, do you have a question or? Anyone else who has a question, you can just raise your hand. We'll unmute you.
Okay, where is that link? Apologies for the disruption. It also allows you to breathe a bit, right? It gives you natural breathing space. Let's see. I hope they can see now. Some No? That's better now? I moved. I see something approaches. I want to finish this because the last one we have, the last session we have, which I'm not sure they'll finish, we can finish tomorrow morning and then we do the session on question. It's very practical, data collection, how do we ask question, how do we do this, right? That we can do tomorrow. So at least today I finish early. And we can use the afternoon to discuss other things individually. Okay, so I was talking about this. We do individual, we have 393. When we do cluster, we have 8 clusters and we pick only 20 individuals per cluster. For both treated and control, how big is the sample? So essentially we have, in this case, we have 1,600 individuals in the treatment and 1,600 individuals in the what? In the control. Okay? Okay, so you see in this case, which one is more costly? When we do individual, the full sample is how many? Is 796, right? 86, right? When we do cluster, how big is the sample? 3,200. So in terms of budget, which one has the bigger impact? Right? That's number one. But the point I'm trying to drive home here, since we know if we take fewer clusters, and within, we could say we take 20 clusters, and within each cluster we take 50 people, We will reduce the sample size, but the bigger the number within a cluster is not useful to us. Are we together? So that means if you're going to do cluster randomization, you would need more clusters to have more variation. Even if you have less number of individuals within the cluster, eventually you might end up having a bigger sample. Are we together? Are we together? Because you don't, it's not about how many people have within the cluster, but it's how many clusters do you have. Okay. So when you're thinking about individual within a cluster, apart from the design setup itself, for sampling consideration, you need to weigh in on this. Are we? Okay. So why do we want to cluster? To do cluster randomization. If it reduces power, because we need more clusters to increase our ability to reject the null. Are we together? If it reduces power, why randomize by cluster? So the reason why we would cluster, one is to minimize or remove what? Contamination. Remember the deworming paper that was done in Busia? They wanted to do cluster at the school level so that you remove possibility of what? Contamination or spillovers. Information campaigns within a village, because villagers talk to each other. So you want to do a randomization on information campaign, and you want to do this is the village. You want to do individual randomization. Do you think they'll keep quiet? There will be spillovers, right? But if you want to do that information treatment, information intervention, you have to do it this village, that village, the other village, so they don't talk to each other. But although these days that's very difficult because people have mobile phones. Okay, they have WhatsApp groups. Also, political feasibility. Example, negative political ramifications from offering social benefit to some poor families in a village, but not others. And that's why you have to cluster. Okay? I'm a member of parliament here, and you're clustering only a few villages, you don't cluster here. It will bring chaos. Are we together? Are we together? So clustering is also strategic, politically correct way of avoiding disaster. And only natural choice. Example, education intervention that affects entire classroom. For example, teacher training. You can't do individual. You have to do cluster. Are we together? So these are some of the reasons why clustering is what? Cluster randomization is what? Is useful. Now, what are the implications of clustering? Before I come to the pictorial representation. Implication of clustering. It is extremely important to randomize an adequate number of clusters. So if you're randomized, you need to have more clusters. You see what I was saying? It can have budgetary what? Implication. Okay? Often number of clusters matter far more than the number of individuals within what? Within a cluster. I've said that already. Okay? And number three, think that law of large numbers as applying to cluster rather than just units within the clusters. We have talked about this. Are we together? Are we together? Are we together? Those are the implications of clustering. Now, how do we estimate intra-cluster correlation? What am I going to talk about here now? We know if we have fewer clusters and we have more individuals within a cluster, that means we have very small inter-cluster correlation because they are similar. And that has a potential risk of what? Not getting any additional information, right? But the more we increase the number of clusters, we need to ask ourselves, what is the correlation between clusters? Because it matters. Are we together? And we're going to see that. And then we will go back to that formula of sample size. So if you're doing sample size with cluster randomization, how big your sample should be, you'll see how now it plays out. But first, let's make sense of intra-cluster correlation. Okay? How do we estimate what we call ICC? Okay? So what is ICC? Intra-cluster correlation. The relationship between one cluster to the other. So there's within cluster Within cluster relationship, which relates to individual observation within a cluster, there's cluster A and cluster B relationship. Are we together? And how do we estimate that intra-cluster correlation between clusters? So ICC, the intra-cluster is the degree of correlation between outcomes within a cluster. So cluster A, cluster B, what's the relationship of the outcomes within each cluster? Okay, and that's why I mentioned you have within cluster relationship and between cluster relationships. Okay, so what do we need to? We need to estimate using baseline data. We already know that. Using similar measures from the same setting, because you cannot use different data to estimate cluster correlation. It has to come from the same what? Setting. So there is similarity. Otherwise, you'll be comparing apples against oranges. Using same measures in similar countries or region. How do we do it formally? Formally, we define the two sources of variability. There's, when you think of sample variability, sample variation, remember, within cluster, there's variation because of the individuals within the cluster. And then between cluster A and cluster B, there's also variability between clusters. Are we together? So there are two sources of variability. So one is individual level what? Variance. Individuals within the cluster. The variance maybe will be small because you increase the number, they're all alike, they're homogeneous, right? But even if they're small, there is variance within the cluster. This we call sigma square. There's tau square, which is the cluster level variance. Cluster 1, cluster 2. Characteristics of one cluster will be different from characteristics of another cluster. So there will be variation as well. So there are two levels. Now we use these two variations to calculate intercluster what? Correlation. And this is how we do it. Okay? So intra-cluster correlation, now represented by what? Rho, is the share of the between cluster correlation out of the total variation, both individual and between. Are we together? We know individual variation within the cluster. We know variation between clusters. Sum of the two, that's the total variation. Are we together? But if we take the proportion of between cluster variation as a percentage of total cluster variation, both within and between, what we have is intra-cluster variation. Essentially, what this formula says is, what is the share, what is the percentage share of relationship between two clusters, taking into consideration the relationship between those two clusters plus relationship of parameters or individuals within the same cluster. So if it's a cluster about informal settings, so you take variation within Kangemi, which is individuals within Kangemi, you estimate what is the variance, Kangemi. You estimate what is the variance, Kibera. What is the variance, Madare? What is the variance, Kayole? Right? Those are within cluster variation. And then you estimate what is the variance between Kangemi and Kayole. Kangemi, Kayole, Madare, Kibera. Are we together? Are we together? Now, once you're able to get that, which is tau, this is tau, then the sum of these two, this is within cluster variation. This is between cluster variation. Sum of these two keeps you total variation. Total variation is composed of two things, within the cluster and between clusters. Are we together? Intra-cluster correlation is the share in the total variation of between cluster correlation. Are we together? This is easy. Okay? Now, let's do math a bit. Remember what I said. Eh? Remember what I said, which is what I'm going to talk about. So if we are saying rho equals to tau plus sigma square, okay? Sigma square is tau square, right? It's variance, sorry. Are we together? If we are saying this, when rho equals to 0, what does it mean? When intra-cluster correlation equals to 0, what does it mean? The variation between clusters is empty. There's nothing, right? So let's see mathematically what that means, because this is the formula we have there, right? So if this equals to 0, that means tau square over tau square plus sigma square equals to 0. Okay? So you know the math. That means tau square equals to what? 0. That's what it means. Are we together? Are we together? When rho equals to 0, which is the intra-cluster correlation, when rho equals to 0, automatically it means between cluster correlation is 0. Are we together? And I've just shown you mathematically. Are we together? Okay. Now, when I'm talking of extreme values, because rho ranges between 0 and 1. So what happens if rho equals to what? 1. So mathematically, this would be tau square plus sigma square equals to 1. Are we together? So I'm going to simplify this. I'm going to make it very easy and juicy and sexy. Let's see how it looks like. We do it here. Okay. So what do we have here? We have tau square plus sigma square equals to 1. You know, mathematically, this equals to what? Tau square equals to square plus sigma square, right? Okay. What does it mean? Sigma square equals to 0. Are we together? So on the extreme case, we have two extreme cases. The first extreme case is rho equals to 0. When rho equals to 0, that means intra-cluster correlation is 0. There's no relationship between one cluster and the other. That's what it means. When intra-cluster is high and equals to 1, what does it mean? Within cluster, are we together? Does it make sense? It makes logical sense. So what we expect to see in this case, what we would expect to see here? What we would expect to see here is intra-cluster correlation that lies somewhere between, it's not 0 and it's not what? It's not 1. It lies somewhere between 0 and what? And 1. And I've answered a lot of questions. So if you're doing individual randomization, right? What does the individual randomization mean? It means rho equals to what? 0. You are randomizing at the individual level. Are we together? Are we together? Are we together? And if you're doing cluster equals to 1, very extreme case, that means there's no variation within clusters. Are we together? I hope this is useful and helps you to unpack what I'm trying to make sense of here. So now let's go back to our formula. Now you'll understand. We are going to go back to our formula. Are we together? Because I said it in the beginning, and this is exactly what I said. If rho equals to 1, all individuals within the same cluster are exactly the same. So there's no value add. There's no variation. Still, that's what we've been talking about. Increasing the number of individuals has no impact on power. It does not increase your ability to reject the null, because you're not going to get any different what? Information. But if rho equals to 0, as if performing individual level randomization. So this one is what I said. If rho equals to 0, essentially you're performing what? Individual randomization. You cannot do cluster randomization. Now let's go to the formula. This is what I said. If this equals to 0, this whole beast is 0. So what do you remain with? This part. Are we together? And this part alone, without this side, is individual randomization. So individual randomization will focus on this thing, this beast in the bracket. And it will depend, the sample size for individual randomization will depend on sigma square, which is what? Standard deviation. It will depend what? Type 1 error. Are we together? That we need to minimize. It will depend on type 2 error, which we already know. It will depend on the minimum effect that we will what? Will be able to estimate. And we've talked about how we can go about it. This will give you the sample size you need for individual randomization. But if you're going to do cluster, you'll have this beast and you'll add more. You'll have to think of raw. And how do we estimate raw? I talked, use baseline data, what others have done. What is the intercluster correlation between Kangemi and Kayole? So maybe someone has done it. Look for data, cluster the data within these two groups, calculate ICC, plug it here. And what is H? H is the number of clusters. There are 10, there are 20, there are 30, and so on and so forth. Are we together? Does it make sense? Okay, so let's see how this looks like in a pictorial representation. So this is what it looks with low intercluster correlation. Low what? Intercluster correlation. When it is low, there is some level of what? Variance. You see they're pink. Sindio, are we together? When we have high intercluster correlation, do you see now they pretty much look similar? Look, this group, they are similar, they are similar, they are similar, they are similar. So sampling more in each of these groups is useless. It's a waste of money. Now you have more powerful way of thinking about sampling. Are we together? When you would go about, I want to interview, do you want more of the same or you want differences? So this is the case when you have very high intracluster correlation. The previous one was the case when you have very low intracluster correlation. Are we together? Now, more clusters, the better. I've talked about this, right? Now we know that. More clusters, what? If we go back to the two studies, the one we had, suppose this year we have, this one has 8 clusters, 20 individuals per cluster, 1,600. This one has 40 clusters and 1,067 individuals within clusters. And intracluster correlation is 0.405. It's very low. So which one would you choose between these two studies? The first one or the second one? Eh? Would you choose 116 for your power, or would you choose 4,206? You see now how you can decide how big your sample should be, right? From now on, I would not expect you to just wake up and say, my sample will be 200. I would expect you to think. And if you can't, get a statistician. The beauty is now, when a statistician talks, they will not lie to you anymore. You'll be understand what they're saying. Are you together? Are we together? Now, how do we increase statistical power? How do we increase our chance of not making type 2 error? In other words, how do we increase our statistical power? There are several things to think about. Okay? So first of all, what do we have control over? What can we control here? Sample size, expected effect size, number of clusters, number of units per cluster, which we can determine there, variance, which can be based on stratification, baseline, rounds of follow-up data. We'll talk about all of this. How many times should we follow up? Okay? What do we have control over? So you see, all these things help determine how big your sample should be. Are we together? How big your sample should what? How we can increase the statistical power is contingent on our thinking around D, our thinking around this number for unit and the way they vary, our thinking of type 1 and type 2 errors, our predisposition there, and what informs that predisposition, our thinking of raw intercluster correlation in case of clustering, and the number of clusters we want to include in the sample. How many? Are we together? Jameni, wajameni, are you following? Okay, we are coming to an end of this interesting, fascinating conversation. What are the sampling approaches? Are there questions?
There's one from Elma. She's talking about, so if you've drawn a randomized sample and you've factored in proportionality in terms of area and size, but you've realized the sample in an area, the sample is really small, yet you know that there's great impact there. So do you increase that size, sample size, and what's the best way to do it, or just leave it all together?
So what come again with the question?
You have drawn a randomized sample and factored in proportionality in terms of area and size. And then in some areas, you realize the sample is very small, but you understand that there's great impact in that, that area. So do you increase the samples, the size, and what's the best way to do it, or just leave it all together?
So if it's the same area, if you increase the sample, then you're going back to the same thing. There's nothing new that is different. Perhaps in your randomized approach, you need to think in statistics, there are techniques on small area estimation. You might want to think about that small area estimation combined with your randomization. But even if it's small and you feel, I think I see a lot of subjectivity. You feel there's an impact. You don't know, you feel there's an impact. Increasing the sample doesn't solve your problem. I think I would still go by what is the conventional and objective way of deriving, generating the sample and try to estimate the impact, okay? Now, if the sample is too small, then don't sample, do census. Remember we said, do we have to sample all the time? You don't have to sample, okay? If the sample is too small, there's no point of sampling and it's a small area, then do census. Everyone should be involved in your analysis. Just do control treated, but you should ask yourself, if you do that, what about external validity, okay? I hope I've answered the question. Sampling approaches. Sampling size. Size is not the only relevant factor. The way the sample is drawn from the population of interest is very important. So you can say, so we have talked now of sample size, right? How big the sample should be. But how big the sample should be is not enough. So I'm making life very difficult. How you draw that sample, however big it is, however small it is, how you draw it, that sample matters. Now, qualitative people do purposive, convenient sampling, snowball sampling, and that's where the crash begins with hardcore people. Ah, you guys are shallow, you're biased, right? And then they'll come back and say, ah, you think we are biased? You have no context. That's why your models and assumptions don't work in our reality. And they fade. These are debates, intellectual debates. So size is not the only relevant factor the way the sample is drawn from the population of interest. Sampling requires 3 steps. First, determine the population of interest. Second, identify a sample frame. And third, draw as many units from the sampling frame as required by power calculation. Are we together? What does it mean? You need to do power calculation. Once you have done power calculation, draw as many as you can based on your power calculation. Okay? So let's start off with sampling frame. How will you find the population of interest? List of units in the population of interest. Common sources, population census, if it's quasi-experimental study, school census, whether student census, okay? Business registries for microfinance enterprises, and data from program itself. This is where M&D is important because M&D collect data, right? Data from the program can be very useful, okay? That could be your sampling frame where you can draw a sample from, okay? What are the concerns with sampling frames? Sampling frame always likely to be slightly different from population of interest. There could be coverage bias, as she said, a small area, right? It may exclude specific segments of your population, and that can reduce external validity for the whole population. Are we together? Just the question that was asked. For example, if you use phone book as a sampling frame for household in a city, what about households that don't have phones? They're automatically excluded, right? Are we together? So you have to be careful when you think of a sampling frame. Okay. If you focus on those who have internet, what about those who don't have internet? Okay, maybe these days they have internet through Safaricom, right? So when you're drawing a sample frame, you're targeting, you have to be very careful so that you don't exclude. Yeah. If you're talking of business register, you may exclude informal sector. When you want to talk of hustler movement, you go to the registrar of companies and you identify, say, this is my sample. I'm going to draw a sample of 10%. But what about those informal businesses that are not registered? They will never be anywhere in your study. Are we together? So when you're deciding on sampling frame, you have to be very careful. Village meeting promotion health insurance. It's only for those who go to the meetings. In fact, in other countries, in other cultures, it's only those meetings that men sit. In Kikuyu, there's that place where women don't go. They just bring soup and go. Right? So now you want to start the Kikuyu culture, you'll be missing. You'll not ever include women. Although these days, Kikuyu women, they're tough. They don't joke anymore, which is good. Women need to be empowered. Okay? Village meeting promotion health insurance, it's only for those who would go to the meeting. So if you target village as a sample frame, you're going to miss out. So if I didn't go to the meeting that day, I'm out of the sample. And I could be a very useful person for you to interview. Are we together? These are very important considerations to think about when you're designing, when you're thinking of sample frame. Now let's talk about sampling procedures. Yes. Pass the mic.
Now, during COVID and even post-COVID, we saw a lot of situations whereby people are drawing sampling frame from WhatsApp groups.
From WhatsApp?
Yeah.
so those who are not in the groups are excluded.
Yeah. Now, how valid are those studies? Some of them were published in high places. So now, for example, if you want to get some views from maybe lecturers, you target their WhatsApp groups. How valid are such sampling frames? Yeah.
So there's a question of representation, but also that could be the limitation of the study. Maybe that's the reason why they were published, because not all. You don't have to be perfect. Okay. If they acknowledge the limitation in the methodology in the data collection, perhaps that explains why it was, because all studies are not perfect. So if you're able to acknowledge and indicate how they went around to mitigate potential pitfalls of that analytical framework, that explains why. But it still doesn't take away the fact that you're excluding those who are not in the group. But even then, everyone if was in the group, they won't all of them be surveyed anyway. So it's a balancing take. It's a balancing act, let me put it that way. It's a give and take. So let's go to sampling procedure. How to choose a sample from sampling frame. So one, I'm gonna start with the probability sampling because that's what I'm keen on. Non-probability sampling, these one qualitative people. If you're doing a qualitative survey, this is your thing. There are so many approaches. So probability sampling, we have random sampling, simple random sampling, which we have talked about. Everyone has an equal chance of being selected. We know that. We do have stratified random sampling, which is stratified based on strata, age, sexuality, gender, I don't know. And then we have cluster random sampling, which you do sample based on cluster of blocks, region, district, whatever, okay? And then we have the second category, non-probability sampling, convenient sampling, where it is convenient. This one is closer to me, I'll sample this one. That one is easy to reach, I will sample that one, okay? That's what qualitative people use. Quarter sampling, where you have a certain quarter you want to draw a sample from, maybe 10, 20 people. We'll see that. Purposive sampling, this one, I just choose, wait, can I interview you? Can I interview that? And so on and so forth. These ones are not usually recommended for quantitative research. These ones are recommended for what? Qualitative research. Are we together? Are we together? Not that they're bad. If they were bad, they wouldn't be there. But they have their own use. So context is always important. I've talked quickly, simple random sampling. I don't think I need to repeat. This is very easy. Okay, everyone in the population has an equal chance to be in the sample. Yeah. And then stratified sampling, I've talked about it. You stratify the sample into groups, male, female, urban, rural, income quintiles. This is poor, this is rich, this is bad, this is richest. And then you randomly select individual within each group of the strata. All individuals in the group have an equal chance of being selected. So first you create strata, and everyone in the strata has an equal chance of being what? Selected. This is master's group, this is PhD group. In master's group, everyone has an equal chance of being selected. So you apply simple random sampling in master's group. You apply PhD, you apply the same approach in the PhD group, and so on and so forth. What are the advantages? And so by doing that, they become representative of population in each subgroup. Not population of not representative of the entire population, but of each what? Subgroups. Advantages: can make inference about impacts on subgroups, very easy, which is nice. Can compare impacts across subgroups, intercluster Manenos, okay? Disadvantages: it may require large samples, the same argument we had for clustering, right? You need more clusters, and it can be more costly for that matter, okay? Now, what are the purpose of stratification? Stratification pursues two goals. You want to improve precision of the overall estimate. You want to obtain separate estimates of adequate precision for each strata, for each of the group. Unfortunately, both seem to be difficult to reach in practice at the same time. So there's a trade-off. Either precision of the overall estimates or precision of a particular group. The same way we saw within cluster correlation and between cluster correlation, and the trade-off that exists between the two, okay? If rho is 1, we know we have similar units within the cluster, individual randomization is ruled out. If rho is 0, we have to do what? Individual randomization. The way samples are allocated matters, very important. There are so many there are 3 alternatives. There's equal allocation within each strata. How do you allocate sample size within each strata? If it's PhD, how many PhDs are you going to capture, doctoral students? If it's masters, if it's undergrad, how many? So one, it could be equal allocation approach. Another one, it could be proportional allocation approach. Neyman allocation, which strata size and outcome variables are taken into consideration. You don't have to be a statistician. Get a statistician that will help you on those things, right? Are we together? Okay. Now, what about cluster or multi-stage sampling? So cluster random sampling is not commonly applied in practice because sampling frames are often incomplete. For example, census data are usually collected each 10 years. Voter registration or telephone listings are incomplete. So you can do 2-stage or multi-stage sampling as a solution. First, you can do cluster, what we call primary sampling unit, PSU. If you have seen in the data, PSU, okay? In some cases, this, for example, could be household. So it's like you want to sample at 2 levels. Level 1, community. Level 2, businesses. Are we together? But your target to interview is businesses. Are we together? But these businesses are within communities or districts or sub-areas. Are we together? But your goal is to interview the individual businesses. That's exactly what. So you can create multi-stage, and household surveys usually do that. They do multi-stage sampling, okay? Are we together? For example, here, that's why I was talking cluster, geographical units. So random, we've talked about that. So groups, you group units into natural clusters. It could be geographic, it could be what? Functional. Are we together? And then you randomly sample clusters. If it's, let's say, district, you randomly draw and say county 1, 2, 3. There are 47. You randomly select counties, right, within particular cluster. And then within each cluster, you survey all units, or you choose random sample of units to survey within each cluster. Are we together? Are we together? So if you say 47 counties, I randomly select, I get Nairobi. So within Nairobi, I either survey everyone in Nairobi, or I randomly select a certain sample I need from where? From Nairobi. Okay? Advantages, cost saving. It doesn't have to go, you don't have to go everywhere, and can permit larger samples because of the geographical demarcations that you can draw. All right, good people? Now, what are the things to keep in mind when we think of sampling and sampling manenos? Be careful thoughts should go into choosing your sample. Very, you need to spend time to think about your sample. Remember power calculation. Power calculation should remind you that you need to avoid false conclusions that program doesn't work. So avoid false conclusions. Power calculation will help you to avoid wasting resources or collecting too much or too little data. Clustering is an example. You don't want to put so many people in the same cluster and waste resources, only that to realize you needed few people within a cluster so that you have a representative sample. Remember, many factors go into sample size needed, and pay special attention to how you assign the treatment, and always remember the sampling strategy: population of interest, sampling frame, and the sampling methodology. This power calculation tells you how big is your sample. Sampling strategy tells you how to draw this size of the sample that has been determined here. Okay, very important. And before all of this, you need to think of the sample characteristics, the underlying, the things that I said. Are we together? Are you following? If it wasn't for my meeting today, I would have been able to finish, but I want to be able to go and get prepared for the meeting. But what we have is what I will do tomorrow up to tea break, which is again very interesting because it's practical. Tomorrow we'll go into the field now. How do you look like in the field? What kind of question? How do you ask questions? How do you avoid biases? What are the ethical considerations? What are the etiquette issues you need to pay attention to? You're organizing field work. How do you organize your team? What are the things to pay attention to, and so on and so forth? Are we together? And I'll share with you a practical example of the project we did in Kenya. Okay? Okay? Okay, now I can take questions before I disappear. Any questions? But are you all following? My suggestion for today, we have cases, right? My suggestion for today, before we go home, we have pretty much covered everything. Break yourself into small groups. It's also part of networking, right? And I think Jane might help to create Zoom groups if people are interested. Randomly, do random. The Kenyans, the Tanzanians, put them in one group. How many are there online? Create a few groups if you can. I would encourage you to spend time to discuss some of these cases. An hour, it doesn't hurt, to see how much you have understood and also to learn from each other. Are we together? So that you don't waste the day. Although I know you probably want to do other things. For those who are here after lunch, while you're waiting for your tea, I think tea is served as still, right? Oh, there'll be no tea. Okay, they've decided to, because I'm going with the tea. There'll be tea? Okay, no problem, never mind. So what I'm saying is, let's use that time to interact and reflect. We have learned so much, haven't we? The material, you see now why I said this course should have been a whole semester. This is heavy. And you remember I said, usually when you walk in, you're empty. And I'm sure now you can appreciate when I say you had 0 when you entered, but you are no longer in 0 now. Right? Are we clear? Any question before you go for lunch? Okay, silence means there's no question. So Again, thank you so much for your time. I wanted to finish everything today, but now I think they get very interesting. We talk more to understand better, but I promise you tomorrow we'll finish the first part, and then we'll use after tea break to talk about projects, case studies, questions that you might have. So I would encourage, that's why I want you to look into the case studies, so you can go home and reflect. And when we come tomorrow, you can raise those questions. I might not be able to answer everything, but at least I can provide context, and maybe we can discuss within the class what is feasible, what is not feasible. We have practitioners online. There are people who are practicing these things. So to be useful to sort of have a convergence in terms of conversation around, maybe I understood this way, how do we do this? And then of course, I'll refer you to the readings. We have a whole range of things for you to read. You want to become a guru, you want to understand these things, there's no easy way. You'll have to go and read. And the beauty is these books are free. The papers are free. It's upon you and your time. Okay? Are we together? All right. Otherwise, thank you so much. People online, enjoy your lunch.